Cities are theaters for change and innovation, seats of power and crucibles of knowledge.
Cities are the future of humanity.
By 2050, 68% of the global population will be living in cities that are already bursting at the seams, or moving into others that are yet to be conceived. Never before has it been so imperative to get the recipe right, to create sustainable, livable cities that inspire and excite us all.
This is the media capital of the world, the cultural capital of the world, the financial capital of the world. When things happen here, it gets noticed and it matters.
Infrastructure, housing, public open space.
Roads and trains and water and power.
Art and culture and things that move our soul.
We're gonna have a planet of 10 billion people. To me, the question is, how do we do that in a way that lives in harmony with the resources of the planet, creates social equity, creates opportunity?
As we race towards a more urbanized future, there is much to learn from the present and the past. From the now, the how, and the wow of building the greatest cities in the world.
New York City is a place for everyone.
Most people think of New York as this giant city of 8 to 9 million people. But for those of us who live here, we have our communities and our neighborhoods, and it really gives a sense of belonging in this giant, chaotic urban center.
People think of New York as this sort of cold, brash, businessy kind of place, but there simultaneously are like 1,000 acts of kindness every day. There's this sense that we're all in it together. It feels like a miracle.
Yeah, we're a little brusque, but most New Yorkers will help someone in need, but just don't get in our way. If you're coming out of the subway, don't stop at the top of the stairs to look at your phone. Don't walk 4 people across the sidewalk. We will cut through you like a battleship going through butter.
So this is New York, New York. The city's so nice, they named it twice. The so-called capital of the world. It's home to more than 8 million people, nearly 1 million of whom are millionaires.
New York is perhaps the premier global city. It's a kind of a symbol, as a beacon of what a capitalist, market-based society can achieve.
Downtown Manhattan, specifically Wall Street, is buzzing. A global hive for business, commerce, banking, and finance for more than 200 years. Attracting investors and venture capitalists like bees to the proverbial honeypot.
Wall Street's constantly innovating, constantly coming up with new ways to provide money, to provide liquidity. It's the grease that lubricates the American economy.
Needless to say, the pursuit of profit here comes with a sky-high price tag.
Nothing is a more visible symbol of the striver's success than the skyline itself.
The cost of living in Manhattan in 2019 was 148% higher than the national average. To buy a home here can cost upwards of $1,371 US per 30 centimeters square. And as for 5-figure credit card debt, it's a burden 1 in 5 New Yorkers bear. To ever so slightly misquote Oscar Wilde, anyone who lives within their means here suffers from a lack of imagination.
Manhattan, sitting at the head of New York Bay, corseted by 2 rivers. Ships as big as its buildings berth here.
The city owes much of its early success to its location at the mouth of the Hudson.
New York City is here because of its harbor, first and foremost. And so that meant that we were a place of trade and commerce.
Manhattan became the business hub because that's where the port was. The original seaport was down near the South Street Seaport at the foot of Broad Street.
To understand the early history of New York, you have to understand that it was first called New Amsterdam. That created a trading post in Lower Manhattan in the 1620s.
Wall Street during the Dutch period was actually literally, there was a wall. The lower tip of Manhattan was essentially a kind of a medieval city protecting the Dutch.
The colony was established by the notorious Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational mega corporation, valued in today's terms over $7 trillion. More than double the combined worth of Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft today. As they amassed their fortunes and built their monopolies, these wily merchant kings gave rise to capitalism, which in a sense birthed our modern, globalized world.
The Dutch viewed diversity as the key to profit. By 1640, there are approximately 700 souls living in the colony. They're worshiping 13 religions, and they're speaking 18 languages. If you want to make money, you diversify. Diversity equals commerce. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but commerce is the god of Manhattan.
And nothing accelerates the building of a city faster than the religion of money.
Economic success brings more people, which generates more economic success. And if you look at the lower tip of Manhattan, after the Civil War, it was a magnet for railroad, shipping lines, stock, bonds, trading, law firms, printing presses, newspapers. The corporations need to be near the finance people, the factories need to be near the port, the rail lines, and the shipping. They want to be near the seat of government so they can have some sort of say over policy. They were drawn together. They needed to be together. To succeed in business requires you to be part of this really thick web of markets.
New York's the world's largest financial center. In America, they call it the Big Apple.
In 1811, the state, actually working with the city, decided that they needed a plan to encourage people to get beyond that because it was getting so crowded. And so what they did was they came up with this idea of a rectilinear grid for the entire island of Manhattan up to 155th Street.
This master plan for Manhattan imposed a two-dimensional grid on land that was largely rural, carving it up into 2,028 blocks, a task that would take many decades to complete.
The grid is designed to systematize New York.
Repetitious and uncomplicated. The grid was an urban pattern favored by empire builders since antiquity.
Manhattan was swampy, Manhattan was rocky, and it was probably as hilly as a city like Jerusalem or Rome. But you see none of it today. It was all leveled, and the holes were filled in, and the hills were knocked down. So when you look down those long sort of Manhattan vistas, they're completely artificial.
You can see people, you can see the sky, you can see the river. So I think that just brings that sense of possibility.
That grid really encouraged people to invest in real estate because they knew that one day streets would be opened further north, and people did. They started acquiring real estate and building streets.
From 1785 to 1790, this city was actually the capital of America, with a population nudging 340,000. Little more than a century later, it was overflowing with 3.4 million.
On January 1st, 1898, the city of New York was born as we know it today. 40 separate municipal governments came together so that we could call ourselves the largest city in the world. We wanted to be a little bit bigger than London, so we converged all of these different communities.
It was hailed as the greatest experiment in municipal government the world has ever known. And even though that implies a certain level of uniformity, the move never robbed the boroughs of their separate identities.
There are stereotypical personalities to each borough. Manhattan, you have the posh, stiff upper lip, phenomenally wealthy Upper East Side, simultaneous with the hip, bohemian Greenwich Village. You've got the impoverished artist of the Lower East Side with the internationally renowned multi-gazillion dollar gallery owner of Soho 20 minutes away. Brooklyn is amazing. You've got the hipsters of Williamsburg living with the Hasidic Jews, living nearby to Bedford-Stuyvesant, one of the most important African-American communities in the entire city, second only to Harlem. Staten Island routinely says, we want out of New York City. It's a lot of people that left Brooklyn, mostly Italian and Irish, But now there's a growing community of people from Sri Lanka and from India and wealthier Southeast Asians who've gone from Manhattan's Chinatown to Brooklyn's Chinatown to Staten Island. The Bronx is the only borough that's connected to mainland America. So you've got this incredible connection to America for commerce. It's where our giant fish market is, our produce market, our meat market that feeds New York City.
And then there's Queens.
Queens is the most diverse county in the United States. More languages are spoken in Queens than any other place in the United States. You can get food from every part of the world there. You can walk out onto that sidewalk right now and you'll hear virtually every language known to mankind, every accent.
America at the turn of the century. Men, women, and children streaming to her shores from countries around the world. For 16 million immigrants, Ellis Island in New York Harbor was the golden door.
New York's prosperity was, and still is, inextricably linked to immigration.
This is the most diverse place in the world, and that's because we are so welcoming to everybody.
Of course, we have problems with gentrification and segregation today in New York, but there's still this fundamental ethos of people from lots of different cultures and mindsets colliding and creating this kind of friction and energy in the city.
3.2 million New Yorkers are immigrants. They own half of the businesses in the city and contribute $228 billion to its GDP.
Immigration is something that New Yorkers, I think, are particularly proud of.
There's something about the synergy, the energy that you get by having all these cultures together.
We are connected to the world through our immigrants, through our food, through our theater, through all of these incredible things that make us both global and intensely provincial all at the same time.
New York at some level is a mirror and a window. It both helps us see ourselves better and helps us understand the world better. I want my city to always welcome strivers from around the world. The tired, the poor, the huddled masses, that's what's on the statue in the harbor.
Countless thousands of youngsters have thrilled to their first glimpse of her. Mounted on a pedestal of concrete and granite, her body fashioned out of metal, she is still every inch a warm, inspiring symbol of man's faith and freedom.
Dedicated in 1886, the 93-meter statue in the harbor was a gift from France on the centenary of American independence. The 7 spikes on her crown represent the 7 continents and 7 oceans, the universal concept of liberty.
It shows the ties our countries had, the abandonment of slavery, thus the chain around her ankle, the tablets of the Declaration of Independence.
For millions of immigrants looking for adventure and opportunity, or more accurately, a safe haven far from their war-ravaged homes, Lady Liberty became an enduring symbol of their story, admittedly by appropriation, not design.
She has nothing to do with immigration. The Emma Lazarus poem was added in the 20th century. Give me your tired, your poor, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. It's not original. It was added. It's one of those wonderful historic objects that through a twist of fate has become an icon.
Representing the cornucopia of opportunity that would give rise to the great American dream.
If you make it here, you can make it anywhere. There's a great saying, it said in the Lower East Side, it's a process of 10 years. So there's this idea, in 10 years you could go from nothing to the middle class or the upper class. What's in the DNA of New York City is opportunity.
The important thing, of course, is that the heart of the city has a booming beat, stronger than ever before. Times change, and you either change your city to fit them, or they'll change your city.
Neighborhoods in the Lower East Side in the late 19th century were literally the densest neighborhoods on planet Earth. So the business district couldn't really expand. We're kind of hemmed in. And the skyscraper fundamentally is a solution to a problem, which is we need more land. So what do? Figure out a way to make land in the sky. The solution was a technological one. It was the idea of using originally iron and then steel framing to create a structure that essentially released the walls from bearing the load. And once you have this skeletal structure of iron, you could just go up.
Zoning laws, implemented more than a century after the infamous Manhattan Grid, really determined the three-dimensional shape of the city, its vertical stratification.
One of the things it governed was uses, where you can put commercial uses, where you can put residential, but it also governed bulk, how big a building can be and what its shape can be. And at that time, people were worried that there were skyscrapers going up and there'd be no light and air left for anybody. So it essentially took every block in New York City and assigned it a regulation that said, how much land can you build in the sky? How many times can you replicate that ground plane in the sky? And that continues to exist until today.
The rise and rise of Manhattan continued, unabated even during the Great Depression. In fact, 1931 was one of the industry's most active years, with 32 skyscrapers reaching their zenith, including the 102-story Empire State Building, which remained the world's tallest for 40 years. It housed so many businesses, it was given its own zip code.
The skyscraper is a cause and consequence of what I would call the urban economic imperative. It's an inevitability. It is the path to the future. The demand for urban living, the demand for working in central cities today is as strong as it's ever been. So you cannot deny that urban imperative.
New York is the concrete jungle it was destined to be, but it's also a city of trees, due in no small part to additional zoning regulations introduced in the 1960s.
Many people in New York live on top of each other.
We don't have the luxury of the suburbs of, front yards, backyards.
So the idea of creating either pocket parks where they can go and sit under a tree, or a central park where they can recreate and walk or go on a boat or bicycle is really, really important.
So New York City has nearly 600 of these indoor and outdoor spaces called POPs, which stands for privately owned public spaces. And they have been built over time since the 60s through the zoning regulations, which incentivize developers to build these in exchange to build a bigger, bulkier building than otherwise the regulations allowed for them to build.
Clearly a quid pro quo that ticks everyone's boxes.
To really see the theater of public life, to see all of the urban life unfold in front of you every day in New York happens in our streets, our plazas, our parks. Those kinds of spaces are what makes cities so great.
Of course, the ultimate space for New Yorkers to embrace their inner Attenborough is Central Park, a prime example of visionary urban planning.
I can't imagine Manhattan without Central Park. 843 acres of green space in the middle of some of the most valuable real estate anywhere in America.
We were very smart and we put Central Park smack in the middle of this very dense Manhattan, which has really given us breathing room.
This is a place with breathing space and elbow room and music and hot dogs and innocence for visitors and New Yorkers alike. The 843 acres of green countryside called Central Park.
If New York is truly the Big Apple, then this is its magnificent core, attracting around 42 million visitors per year. Larger than the Principality of Monaco, it also features 93 kilometers of hiking trails and 9,000 wooden benches to take pause and catch one's breath.
When you go to Central Park, there are these outcroppings of rock, Manhattan schist, which goes just miles into the earth. And Manhattan schist is incredibly hard to dynamite, especially in the 19th century.
New York is built on the rock of Manhattan Island, and that means blasting.
It was cost prohibitive to remove it to build buildings. By converting it to park space and enhancing the property value of the four sides of the park, we made a democratic space for people of all ethnic and economic backgrounds to mingle in nature.
Over the years, this vibrant green space has had to winter the whims of the volatile greenback.
Central Park has always been at the mercy of city budgets. Recession and high inflation.
The city itself was pretty broke in the mid-20th century.
By the early 80s, Central Park was a shambles, a lawless and dangerous ruin.
By all means, run in the park, preferably by day.
In a few short-sighted decades, this national treasure became a national disgrace.
So Central Park and other parks in the latter part of the 20th century figured out a model where they could actually bring private investment in. And now much of Central Park is actually privately operated by a conservancy. It's fantastic.
The Central Park Conservancy have done a spectacular job of bringing private money to restore the park for public use.
The city still gives it some money and still oversees it, but the biggest parks in New York, including Prospect Park and others, are now operated privately.
From tarnished gem to sparkling jewel, Central Park has never looked more resplendent than it does today, contributing enormously to the overall livability of the city.
To me, the term livability, it's a way of saying it's a city for people, or that it's designed with people in mind. It's something that makes our everyday life more complete. One of the things that is really interesting about New York is that you get so many characters of neighborhoods. And so you can create your own story.
It's village living. If you can create a city where most people can walk within 15, 20 minutes to achieve 80% of their needs, drop their kid off to school, get fresh groceries, get their mother health care, that's a wonderful way to live.
It's really about thinking about mixed use in a productive way.
Creating neighborhoods where residents can work and play.
And what that means is you're sort of bringing the mountain to Muhammad, right? You're actually starting to build places of work closer to more affordable neighborhoods. With technology, we're seeing the multinodal city really flourish. This has always been true in places like London and the San Francisco Bay Area, many nodes. But in New York now, you know, we're designing an office building on the waterfront in Brooklyn where you never, ever would have seen an office building even 10 years ago.
This dynamic island of stone and steel and people continues to change its face as the building boom goes on. It cannot fail to inspire a sense of awe at its mighty symmetry.
The waterfront used to be a place where industry happened, but as the shipping industry changed and those uses went to other places in the region, we've reclaimed our waterfront and made them parks and housing and jobs.
Repurposing public spaces is a big movement, definitely has taken the forefront in a lot of cities these days.
And most of the global cities are either on rivers or on coastlines.
New York City has more shoreline and access to water than any other city in the Americas.
Our harbor defines us, our waterfront defines us. It's our greatest natural asset, and we're reclaiming it and learning to live better with it.
I think New York City has done a wonderful job of repurposing its waterfront. And so what you'll see now is a ribbon of parks right the way around Manhattan. Took us till this century to figure out that you want to have parks around the rim of water when you don't need to use it for commercial uses. So that's one thing that I think New York really can bring to other global cities.
Now that the water is so much cleaner than it was, the shad are swimming up the Hudson again as they haven't for decades.
We now have a new New York City ferry system that's connecting the 5 boroughs.
It's really tapping and using its resources in different ways and sort of reimagining how to use them. That also relates to the whole idea of the High Line. The High Line was something that was slated to be taken down.
Used to be for freight in the meatpacking district, and it became this derelict structure over time. Through advocates and through city support, they were able to save that structure and transform it into this green ribbon really in the sky.
Opening in 2009, the High Line has become a celebration of advocacy, art, and nature, and now welcomes over 408 million visitors a year.
It's definitely a unique experience compared to other open spaces because you're elevated. So your vantage point of the city is a very different one than you see from at ground level on parks and plazas.
It has really brought another perspective about what public space can be in New York.
It's a gem that we almost lost or didn't have in New York City.
When New Yorkers seek sanction in their pocket parks and gardens, they're most often than not trying to find an antidote to this. Arguably, some of the most congested city streets in the world. Almost 32,000 kilometers of roadway connect the 5 boroughs of New York. 40,000 intersections, 14,000 parking meters, 11,400 traffic lights, and more than 1 million street signs.
New York City is a city of congestion, and there's a seafaring captain who said he'd rather cross the Atlantic in a squall than Broadway at noon.
Congestion is the bane of every driver's existence in New York City, something the state intends to mitigate with the introduction of a controversial congestion tax.
The police department is installing technology to scan and photograph the license plates of all vehicles coming onto the island.
From 2021, if you want to drive your car in Manhattan below 60th Street, you'll be slugged with a $12 to $14 fee.
We've seen such rapid changes in the last 10 years that we did not see in over 100 years. And there are changes in so many directions at once. It's the micro deliveries, it's the bike share, pedestrian plazas, scooters, Uber, Lyft came on the scene, and we saw traffic speeds all of a sudden drop from that 7.5 miles an hour to 4.5, 5 miles an hour. It's like a scene out of Network screaming out their windows, I'm mad as hell, do something about it.
Doing something about it for many, many years was actually Sam's responsibility, a job that gave him way more street cred than most.
Cities plus math plus science equals traffic.
America still has a percentage of cars to the population far exceeding any other country, which makes her problems just that much more complicated. So what a boom this highway will be to the average man in New York, who is also the average motorist.
40 years ago, 1980, there was a transit strike, and I said the grid could lock up. We could have gridlock. The word soon became one word, and I became the father of gridlock. I get chills up my spine every time I hear a president of the United States or some leaders in Europe use the word gridlock.
In a former life, Gridlock Sam was a taxi driver.
Back in the 50s, I would liken a cab driver in New York to a bartender. You had conversations with your cab driver. Your cab driver gave you advice on life.
Back then, cab licenses, or rather medallions, were strictly limited and worth a small fortune.
The medallion at the beginning of the decade, 2010, was exceeding $1 million.
But in recent years, rideshare services have seen their value plummet.
So these people's livelihoods were destroyed almost overnight. Uber and Lyft and others have destroyed particularly taxi systems. So cities should have their eyes wide open and prepare for that and have good alternatives, and don't abandon your transit systems and don't abandon your taxi cab industry.
To really take the pressure off these often gridlocked streets, many believe the city needs to lift its game beneath them.
The subway was never designed to accommodate a regional population of 20 million people.
Really, at this point, the system should probably be twice as big as it is, but it has only opened about 2 or 3 new stations in the last 30 years.
Be that as it may, when you crunch the numbers, it's still an impressive piece of infrastructure. It has a world record-setting number of stations, 472 in all, connected by 416 kilometers of track, and it carries around 1.6 billion passengers a year.
This city would not exist without its subway. The subway is what allows us to be New York City, to have such high-density living.
There are many cities around the world that have built metros, and yet they're for a certain class of people.
The best transit systems are not the transit systems built for the poor. The best are the transit systems built for everybody.
There is no doubt that the subway needs a revamp. Better access, better lighting, a better ride, and the city has earmarked the congestion pricing revenue to help pay for the long overdue upgrade.
Just think about how a good subway system allowed us to expand, allowed people to have better lives for their families. They didn't have to live literally next door.
Congestion pricing will take $1 billion a year. It has to raise $1 billion a year that goes right into transit. That $1 billion, when it's bonded, turns into $15 billion. And we're hoping for $100 billion over the next decade, and that we will have a wonderful system.
The subway is not the only organism spreading its multicolored tentacles into New York's alien subterranean world. There are many other entities competing for the hidden real estate.
It's really a spaghetti-like grouping of pipes under there, which to most people are completely unknowable. Some of them are telecom, some of them are power, some of them are water, and they all lie at various depths. Sometimes they're very near the street, and sometimes they're further down. And those are all separate from the actual subway.
There's over 80,000 kilometers of cabling for telecommunications, enough electrical line to reach halfway to the moon, and over 12,000 kilometers of piping for sewerage.
So New York City, like many northeastern cities in the United States, has a combined sewer system.
If you were to build a city today, you would separate out your stormwater and your sanitary sewage, your domestic sewerage. But back then, they didn't really think about that.
And that has a lot of challenges when there's a particularly high-intensity rainstorm. Thinking about rain, coastal storms, and sea level rise, there's more, direct flooding right into the river. So we've been investing billions of dollars in upgrading that system and reducing those overflows into the harbor. One of the great strategies that we've been doing is green infrastructure and bioswales and tree pits and other means of collecting stormwater. So it's diverting it from the sewer system and not causing those overflows. Instead of digging a hole and putting a pipe in and having that define your sewer system, we're using natural flow, overland, stream systems, retention basins that's helping to reduce flooding in certain neighborhoods, but also naturally filtering contaminants as well as an alternative to the traditional sewer systems.
We've all heard the great urban myth about alligators lurking in New York sewers. But the animal you're more likely to encounter in the system is this little beady-eyed critter.
Rats are denizens of sewers the world over. We are certainly in New York a ratropolis.
I would never want to live on the bottom floor of an apartment in New York because I've heard that your rat problem is ridiculous.
We allowed ships in and we never really thought about rats being on those ships. Where would a rat want to live in a city? All around the world, sewers and rats go hand in hand. It's pitch black, of course, down in the sewer. They don't need much light. Their world is all about feeling and touching and smelling.
And of course, eating.
You take this simple litter basket on the street that nobody pays any attention to, but the fact of the matter is, if we don't choose a litter basket style correctly all night long, they will be feeding the rats. So here in New York City, we have a basket called the Big Belly. And we took the old litter baskets out, we put the new litter baskets in, and the rats left the park. It was that successful. It was no more food. Simple.
The number of rats in New York City is conservatively estimated to be around 2 million, possibly 5 or 10.
They're multiplying too fast for the city to do anything. They could take over if they wanted to. I mean, it's sickening. It's ridiculous.
Rats are public health menaces, without a doubt, and we can't take that lightly.
The latest weapon in the war against rats is technology. Remote sensors that detect the presence of vermin, allowing for swift and targeted extermination.
But that's not going to be enough either. So, to get really rid of the rats, we're going to have increased sanitation from the city itself.
Which, as it turns out, is no small ask, even from the largest waste management agency in the world.
The trash capital of the nation is New York City.
The men and machinery are beaten almost before they begin the cleanup job, and every 24 hours another 30,000 tons hits the pavement. New York's title is safe, the garbage capital of the world.
The worst piece of infrastructure in New York is our waste management system, meaning garbage.
Your garbage goes out anytime after 4 p.m. and is generally collected before 7 a.m. the next morning. So if you're walking around in an area that has a lot of residential, tall buildings, after 4 p.m. you will often see bags of garbage that are waiting to be collected. You're talking about 30,000 tons of waste each day.
The average New Yorker throws away 11 kilos of trash a week. Over the course of a year, that collectively amounts to 14 million tons, costing the city $2.3 billion a year to dispose of.
Well, we just generate way too much trash. If we started composting, you'd see an enormous reduction in the amount of solid waste the city creates. We need to become a circular city where the inputs and the outputs start matching each other. We're just way behind the 8 ball on this.
We've set a target to get ourselves to a zero waste commitment by 2030, which means we need to be diverting all of that waste out of landfills. That means pulling out all the recyclable material and getting that to marketplace in a different way.
The specter of garbage is unlikely to disappear in a New York minute. But on a happier note, there's nothing but praise for how the city manages and distributes its water.
New York City made a dramatic investment in the future by building the aqueduct system, building the reservoirs in upstate, and securing New York City's water future.
New York has an amazing system of water, and it gets its water from north of the city, from 3 separate reservoir systems that bring water down into holding tanks, and it's delivered through tunnels to individual homes and businesses.
4.9 billion liters of water enter the system each day, with 97% of it reaching the city through gravity. Flowing downhill via an ingenious system of underground aqueducts the Romans themselves would envy.
Most of it still comes to the city unfiltered. It's that clean.
To ensure the system continues to function for another century at least, the city is currently investing in a proactive upgrade, and with good reason.
This was the moment when Sandy struck. 90-mile-an-hour winds slicing through New York's streets.
In 2012, Hurricane Sandy gave New York a shocking reality check, revealing its vulnerability in the face of climate change.
Hurricanes don't often sweep through here. This one took the Atlantic in with it.
New York City lowered my hand underwater!
And Hurricane Sandy was the worst natural disaster we've ever faced. $19 billion in damages, 44 lives lost across the city.
Nobody was prepared for it. Now we're trying to figure out how can we prepare for the next one.
Don't mess with Mother Nature, that's correct. Don't mess with Mother Nature.
The city has been thinking about big problems for its entire history. But only recently have we really begun to do that in a comprehensive way in the mayor's office, thinking about the challenges that we face and where we want to go. We are divesting our pension funds from fossil fuels. We have sued Big Oil for the damages that we've seen here in New York City. All of that is really a comprehensive climate strategy that we think other cities should undertake as well. We're a city that's been built up over decades and centuries, and so a lot of our infrastructure is aging and needs to be replaced. Whether it's our sewer and our wastewater system, whether it's our transportation network, the transit system and the subways, all of it is being rethought in this era of climate change, and we have a lot of work ahead of us to really adapt that infrastructure for the future.
Fortune is currently favoring the bold. There appears to be plenty of money in the pipeline to pay for new pipelines. But this hasn't always been the case in the city that never sleeps.
Rising out of the East River, the famous New York Skyline, a city with a budget bigger than many countries. Yet incredibly, despite all its wealth, New York, within a matter of weeks, may be bankrupt.
One of the difficulties of the 1970s is that large corporations were drawn to Connecticut and New Jersey, and we lost a lot of our corporate tax base. New York's apple, if you will, was beginning to rot.
And I find no substantial sentiment to bail out New York City.
500,000 manufacturing jobs disappeared. By the middle of the decade, 1 million New Yorkers were on welfare.
The city became, if you will, addicted to borrowing money from Wall Street to cover its operating expenses.
By 1975, the city was on the verge of bankruptcy, unable to pay its operating expenses or take out a loan.
If the city declared bankruptcy, it would have been a nightmare.
It was in debt to the tune of $11 billion and forced to lay off 16% of the municipal workforce.
Policing and sanitation took a big hit as a result.
Most Americans say that's the trouble with New York. They know how to spend money, but not how to handle it.
Crime rates and economy go hand in hand, and which one comes first depends on the time.
In 1975, 581,247 serious crimes were reported in New York City. The number of murders more than doubled. Rapes and burglaries tripled during the decade, while robberies increased tenfold. Bryant Park was an open-air drug market. Grand Central, a seedy flophouse. And nobody willingly rode the subway for fear of being mugged.
New York is really the center of our civilization. What we need to do is revive New York City.
New York is a 24-hour, vibrant, rich city. It may have more crime victims than Wyoming has people, but as they'd say here, who wants to live in Wyoming?
When Giuliani came about in the mid-90s with ideas about how to restore order and maintenance to society, strategies in mind. CompStat was a way to bring accountability back to local law enforcement executives at the precinct level, as opposed to having strategies from top down.
Suddenly, the NYPD could analyze crime data in real time and respond accordingly.
So you didn't have to wait till the end of the month to figure out what the crime trend is. Somebody at One Police Plaza read that you had a crime spike overnight. You didn't wait till it became a trend. You addressed it the next day. And we made decisions in policing based on that data. How we enforced, where we enforced, what techniques we used.
Another change Mayor Giuliani introduced saw the NYPD working as one rather than many departments.
It wasn't always that way, right? The municipal police, and they had regional police throughout the boroughs, and they had housing authority police, transit police. That went away. Administrations were merged, so you didn't have different chiefs with different goals.
Since preventing crime was in everyone's best interest, it made sense to Giuliani and Bratton that everyone contributed.
Crime prevention through environmental design was actually adopted by a lot of planning organizations, government planning, real estate planners.
Private stakeholders started taking actions to improve the environments that they were responsible for.
Lighting made streets and parks safer. Hedges instead of fences enhanced appeal. And lo and behold, the situation improved. New York regained its mojo.
I don't think you can compare NYPD to any police department in the United States. There was a point where homicides in New York City topped 2,400. I think last year was under 300. That's a huge difference in crime rates. When crime goes down, we see real estate values go up. When real estate values go up, then governments see revenue stream.
New York City has made an extraordinary turnaround. From one of the most notoriously dangerous cities in America to one of the safest in the world. The economy improved, and tourism didn't just flourish, it boomed.
The I Love New York campaign, New York as the Big Apple. The idea that you can come here and fit this beautiful red object in your hand, take a bite out of it, and it's tart and sweet and savory all at the same time was an utterly brilliant campaign.
Over 60 million tourists came to New York City in the last year. 60 million people.
We're hosting people from all over the world constantly, and that's a good influence, I think.
So for every resident, there are 3 tourists. I mean, that's how exciting New York is to people in the 21st century.
Big parts of New York, like Broadway Theater, would die without tourism.
Tourism is absolutely crucial. It's one of the most important industries in New York. It is employing hundreds of thousands of people, if not more. There will always be tourists who come to a city like New York to shop. There'll always be tourists that will come to a city because they want the Michelin 3-star restaurant experience. But there are also a number of tourists who want to come to a place to just experience that place.
And at the top of their list is Times Square.
What do tourists come to see? They come to see light and action, and so that's what the zoning code really caters to. You can see how much real estate has been devoted to them. If you look, it's now practically all pedestrianized for them.
By law, all the buildings in Times Square must be brightly lit. And even though the billboards utilize the latest in energy-efficient LED technology, it still costs a ball-dropping $24,713 per day to dazzle. The lights are so bright, even astronauts can identify the hot spot from space.
You can pay me any amount of money to go there on New Year's Eve. I've had the good fortune to be there once and never again.
When 9/11 happened, New York was physically and emotionally shattered.
Process what happened, deal with the aftermath, and support each other.
It affected many New Yorkers, I think most, with a sense of togetherness, community, resolve, and resistance to that type of violence.
New York City has put itself on a brand new trajectory, and we have figured out how to recover from that event and to really be stronger in the face of the kinds of threats that we know are coming.
The struggle in the post-9/11 world has been how to create a secure city that's still a public city. And I think we've gotten there.
The city has really gone back to its normal cadence and its normal rhythm.
We're all trying to figure out, how do you create a city that's safe and is resilient in the face of terrorism, but also something that still feels like a city, that feels like the place you wanted to come to and not a fortress.
The reinvention of the World Trade Center and the landmark Oculus building, which services the subway, have clearly achieved this. Designed to resemble a bird flying from the hands of a child, it brings a sense of hope to a site of tragedy. A functional memorial that truly reflects the resilience of the city and its citizens.
The Oculus has been a demonstration that we can do inspiring places for infrastructure in New York. We actually connected that place that used to feel very insular back into the city. And you can go and have lunch, and you can go and remember, and you can go and reflect about life and the city. It's such a striking place. It's a place of innovation, and I think that that's what the original World Trade Center was, but also a place now of remembrance and a place that feels part of the city and that everyone has access to.
New York continues to step into the spotlight to show the world what it takes to endure, uniting as one to create solutions that potentially help us all.
The future is working with each other, working in teams, developing new ideas.
We can't just sit back and wait to see what the trend is going to be. We need to be out in front helping drive that trend.
It's a bit like watching the sausage being made. The outcome is going to be fun. You just don't want to see what goes into it.
Human beings have a natural desire actually to be with one another and learn from one another and live together. And I think cities are really the outcome of that desire.
So whether that's new business opportunities, whether that's new ways of collaborating, whether that's the way that we bring ideas all across the globe and launch them out back across the globe, it's because we're all so close together and interacting so often and so much that makes this such a dynamic place to be.
Cities are incubators for change and innovation, seats of power and crucibles of knowledge.
City is, to me, not a function, city is expression.
They are places where people from all walks of life commute, commune, and compete.
It's the center of invention because of the mixing culture, mixing people, and dynamism.
By 2050, 68% of the global population will be living in cities that are already bursting at the seams, or moving into others that are yet to be conceived. Never before has it been so imperative to get the recipe right, to create sustainable, livable cities that inspire and excite us all.
One of the primary functions of the city is itself to be a network, to connect creative people and to give them the platform to save our city from our future's challenges.
This is the now, the wow, and the how of building the greatest cities in the world.
Tokyo is organized chaos. And if you come into it, you're just sort of overwhelmed. There's too much of everything.
It's the most exciting city that I've ever lived in.
It's like really to be in a movie.
I always feel like it's a kindler, gentler Blade Runner set. A very clean-looking but grungy image of a futuristic city.
I cannot remember the last time I walked around Tokyo and felt unsafe. There's taxis everywhere, the buses are running very efficiently. One of the only places I know where you can stumble around completely drunk and you know that nothing will happen to you. So for me, it's that unique combination of excitement, but also stability and safety that make it a really unique place to live.
Only 60 miles from Mount Fuji is the capital and largest city in Japan, Tokyo. And we land here for an unforgettable experience.
So this is Greater Tokyo, the largest city in the world. Home to more than 37 million people. In a nation that welcomes a new arrival every 34 seconds, it's not surprisingly very, very crowded. With 6,264 people per square kilometer living in the heart of the city, personal space is rarely an option.
Downtown can be very stressful. There's too much stimulation, too many people, but somehow it works.
The Japanese are used to it, and they maintain their dignity in those tight spaces. So I think that level of courteousness and crowds create a very livable environment.
What I learned living from Tokyo and what other cities could learn from Tokyo is the quality of smallness. So Japanese people, they do live in very small spaces, and that brings quality to their lifestyle and also to the space they live. They do prefer to have very tiny spaces where they do feel more comfortable. So I think the smallness is a very important quality for Tokyo.
For me, Tokyo is like a collection of big towns. It's not like a big city for me.
There are many villages inside the metropolis of Tokyo, retaining a kind of uniqueness, but merging and blending each other in a very unique way. For instance, if we go to Ginza, it's more about fashion, about luxurious. If we go to Harajuku, it's about street culture and youth. If we go more to Shinjuku or Shibuya, it's more about business. So it's really defined in their cultural aspect.
Part utopia, part dystopia. To find the non-neon roots of this city, you actually have to explore its archives rather than its avenues. For Tokyo appears to reinvent itself every 20 to 30 years, leaving little or no trace of its evolution in the contemporary landscape.
"400 years ago, the Tokyo had been called Edo, city of Edo. It means river mouth, water city, completely surrounded by the river and the harbor or the sea."
Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was to become the first shogun of Japan, he was sent to take over the land here. It was marshland, and he felt like he had just been demoted. He eventually realized that water was really important, that the Kanto Plain would be a great place to grow rice and to have farming villages with reclamation projects.
The process of reclaiming land to create more useful space was and still is a common practice throughout Japan. But the scale on which this occurred in Tokyo was and still is astonishing.
The ground level is under the sea level. It's 1/3 of Tokyo.
The land which is now east of the Imperial Palace into the bay was bay. It was all underwater.
So some amount of soil was transported to the lowland to bury the streams or small size of rivers.
To date, 250 square kilometers have been reclaimed in the Bay Area alone. They created a city that in time resembled Venice.
They developed a network of water systems because the most important goods, that is rice product, is very heavy to carry, so they use in a boat.
Roads also featured in the layout and functionality of Edo.
And Tokyo, and particularly Nihonbashi, is famous as being the center of where the roads start. And those are the roads that the lords of the different provinces had to travel to come to Tokyo. So it turned out to be an excellent place.
Excellent indeed, but sadly, a place ever on the precipice of disaster. Tokyo had to be completely rebuilt after the Great Ginza Fire of 1872.
2,500 dead and missing.
And again in 1923, following the Great Kanto earthquake.
This was Tokyo in September 1923. 74,000 people perished and 700,000 houses were destroyed.
September the 1st, 1923. And it is just at the time people were preparing lunch. Suddenly everything begins to shake. It's huge. It's a 7.9 magnitude, they calculated later. And this knocks everything down.
All of the high building and many of the houses was completely destroyed.
The epicenter was 40 miles south of Tokyo, 6 miles beneath Sagami Bay. A massive piece of the Philippine Oceanic Plate had ruptured, slamming into the Urian Continental Plate. The trembler triggered a tsunami, a series of 40-foot-high waves that swept thousands of people into the sea.
But there was a wind that day, and so very quickly the wind began to spread throughout the city, and it created whirlpools.
Pillars of fire, known as dragon twists, spread the flames from overturned stoves and broken gas pipes far and wide, setting the entire city, which was largely built of wood, ablaze.
Thousands are dead. 1/4 of the nation, over 2 million homeless. Whole cities have been reduced to shambles.
Number of people who died in that earthquake due to just the earthquake is like 1%. The other 90-something% was because of the fire. It burns for 2 days, day and night.
And over 100,000 people lost their lives during that disaster.
Homes, government buildings, shops, parks, roads. 33 million square meters of the city were completely destroyed.
It's amazing that Japan was able to come back from that. And that's part of Japanese character, I think. No matter how bad things get, you don't give up.
The Great Kanto earthquake triggered the beginning of the end of Tokyo's water-based development. As ambitious planners and bureaucrats seized the opportunity to create a city of the future with ideas borrowed from the West. One institution that was relocated and rebuilt as part of the citywide restructure was the central wholesale market, the so-called Wall Street of Fish.
Probably the most famous fish market in the world. And the income itself of Tsukiji is a very important indicator for the GDP of Japan, for Japanese market and Japanese economy.
True to the scrap-and-build culture of Tokyo, the fish market moved again in 2018 onto yet another site made from reclaimed land.
The old market apparently had to move because it was too old, too small. It moved to this artificial island in Tokyo Bay. It looks like more a shopping mall than a market itself. The old market had a unique character and a unique urban structure because it was composed by hundreds of retailers, and those retailers were very tiny, and their ability to network into each other was unique. This sense of smallness now is more controlled, is more transparent. So we have to agree that it's a kind of futuristic market.
Tsukiji has lost a lot of its charisma, but none of its financial clout. Merchants now sell more than 1,600 tons of seafood per day, netting around $14 million. By some estimates, the market turnover is in excess of $4 billion a year.
Japanese culture and Japanese food is based on fish since centuries. So the fish market itself is the place where people from Tokyo and from Japan can actually buy and can trade fish. And just visiting Tsukiji, actually, you can really experience marine encyclopedia. So you can find any type of fish, and that's what makes Tsukiji Fish Market a kind of pantry for Tokyo and for Japan, and maybe for the world as well.
The market is famous for its New Year's auction, where the first tuna sold extracts a hefty price.
But is it worth nearly $750,000? The head of one Japanese restaurant chain thought so. Afterward, he helped carve it up himself.
The post-Kanto earthquake restructure also led to the creation of the Keihin Industrial Zone, located on reclaimed land on the northwestern shore of Tokyo Bay. And the city center shifted west from Ginza to Shinjuku, an area that was considered seismically stable. There are few places on the planet as earthquake-prone as Japan. 1,500 strike the nation every year. Minor tremors occur nearly every day, and as for the possibility of another great mega shake bringing the capital to its knees, it's not a case of if, but when.
Shibuya, one of the busiest shopping areas in the world, built on top of one of the world's most earthquake-prone regions. But as the Japanese shop, the earth is literally moving under their feet.
Tokyo gets hit by the big one every 70 years, so it is overdue 3 decades.
The big one that everyone's talking about is the Tokyo inland earthquake. The government claims that there is roughly a 70% chance of a major earthquake happening here in Tokyo within the next 30 years. And that will lead to, substantial loss of life, disruption to critical infrastructure, all kinds of other impacts that we have not seen here for many, many decades now.
Experts have crunched the numbers and determined that a 7.3 quake beneath the northern end of Tokyo Bay would kill 9,700 people, injure 150,000, and potentially destroy or incinerate more than 300,000 buildings. It would cripple critical infrastructure, hampering the evacuation of 3.39 million citizens, while leaving an additional 5.2 million stranded.
Today, the capital is better prepared, but experts on earthquake preparedness say citizens need to be ready.
Tokyo is one of the most advanced cities in terms of disaster preparedness and disaster management.
Japanese students getting a taste of what everyone hopes will never come. Thankfully, it's only practice at an earthquake simulation center run by Tokyo's fire department.
In Japan, there's this concept called Jijo, Kyojo, and Kojo. It's kind of this 3-element overlapping framework. Jijo means self-protection. So the idea is that I'm prepared myself. I have an emergency bag, I have an emergency plan, I know what to do.
Kyojo
is community self-reliance, is like the literal term. And that means we're going to help each other out. So I'm going to help my neighbor if there's a big earthquake or a big typhoon. And then Kojo means public assistance. So that means we have a fantastic ambulance service, we have a fantastic fire department, and I know that they're going to do what they need to do in the time of a disaster. And the idea is if you can link all of those three, Jijo, Kojo, and Kyojo, then you have a very strong and resilient society. So that's often the narrative that we hear within the disaster management space at all kinds of different levels.
Stricter building codes have come into force, most recently after Kobe, and billions have been spent to prepare the structures for what many believe is the inevitable.
We are always afraid of earthquake. And as an engineer, we dedicated much effort to avoid the vulnerability, but our effort cannot be perfect.
Tokyo now has some of the most stringent building standards in the world. Engineers must design and construct any new building to withstand earthquakes with a magnitude greater than 7 on the Richter scale. They can sway, but heaven forbid, bend.
High-rise happens to be better designed in terms of seismic regulations. Maybe it would not be pleasant, but I don't think there will be many deaths.
Today, Tokyo's skyscrapers symbolize Japan's resilience, and although not immediately apparent, the nation's deep respect for tradition. Taking its cue from an age-old technology used for centuries in multi-story pagodas, the Tokyo Skytree has fast become the global poster child for modern seismic design and engineering.
Tokyo Skytree is the world's tallest freestanding broadcasting tower. It's a striking Tokyo landmark.
The mixture of the old and new meets together in the Tokyo Skytree. We wanted to make the Tokyo Skytree structure was very symbolistic for the people in the region. When deciding the height, we believed that the height, the number should be very remarkable for the Japanese people.
Built at a cost of 65 billion yen, the height of Tokyo's Skytree, 634 meters, was determined by the traditional name of the region in which it stands, Musashi.
The 6 is Mu, and the 3 is Sa, and the 4 is Shi in Japanese, Musashi. So this is an intentional pun.
The Skytree contains a restaurant, a planetarium, an aquarium, and a shopping mall in addition to the infrastructure that facilitates its 2 primary functions.
One is, of course, observation tower to enjoy magnificent view of this Tokyo metropolitan area. Another one is that it's really important, broadcasting tower. So really very important social infrastructure. The color itself is off-white, and that off-white really reflects the lighting. So we use modern technology of LED lighting. So sometimes you can look at this outer shape is shining. Sometimes this central part is shining. Every day you can see a different scene at night. It's a combination of exoskeleton steel and reinforced concrete, so it's a hybrid. That idea came from traditional Japanese architecture. Japan has a long tradition of making Buddhist temple. And if you look at the 5-story pagodas, you will notice they always have a central column inside. This is called Shinbashira.
The hybrid Shinbanshira inside the Tokyo Skytree is fitted with dampers that allow it to sway without hitting the sides of the tower itself.
This column acts as a sort of counterweight against this major main structure of the steel. So that's the mechanism.
As fate would have it, the anti-seismic design of Skytree was put to the test just 1 week shy of completion. when the Tohoku earthquake rocked the entire island of Honshu in 2011. 500 workers were on site at the time, around 50 in the upper levels of the tower, and all were evacuated without incident. While many of the disasters Tokyo has had to endure hold Mother Nature to account, its worst was well within the realm of human control. In the final phase of World War II, Tokyo was bombed 102 times. The deadliest raid in history occurred on the night of the Black Snow, March 9, 1945. When over the course of 3 hours, 279 B-29 Superfortress bombers discharged 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on the eastern side of the city.
"66 cities were destroyed during the war by Allied bombing. 9 million people across Japan were homeless. 4 million people perished, but Tokyo in particular took the brunt of that damage.
In Tokyo, the Japanese capital, the very widespread devastation was caused not by atom bombing, but by a number of heavy attacks by super fortresses. And something like 3/4 of the city is estimated to have been wiped out.
More people were killed in Tokyo in 1945 by firebombing than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. That's savage.
Everything was incinerated. There was nothing left.
In most global cities, old buildings allow us to reflect on the past. They are the immortal echoes each generation leaves behind to define their moment in time. But here in Tokyo, the city has had no choice but to bury its history at every turn. In the wake of World War II, little consideration was given to how Tokyo 5.0 should look. Not only did the Japanese have to remake their city, they had to rebuild their reputation and their economy.
The Japanese economic miracle in many ways started in the 1950s. Sadly, because of the Korean War, Japan was basically a territory of the Allied powers. And from the 1945 to about 1950, the American powers that be at that time were not allowing the Japanese economy to restart. But the Korean War began, and the Americans thought that instead of importing all of these things like pots and pans and clothing and trucks and food and drink from America or other places, Japan's so close, let's manufacture it here. And so when they started making procurement orders for those type of things, the small to medium-sized businesses started humming again. These factories that were idle were restarting.
The Keihin region boomed and more land was reclaimed to create room for industrial expansion. Shipyards, petrochemical complexes, oil refineries, and steel mills began to crowd the newly fashioned waterfront.
Essentially, during the Korean War, $2 billion were put almost directly into the hands of factory owners and their employees. And so that was an incredible shock to the system, and that really kick-started the Japanese economic miracle.
Tokyo in 1964, symbol of the new, prosperous Japan, the 5th largest industrial power in the world, and the only one in Asia. Tokyo in this Olympic year is a city that has been given a violent facelift for the Games.
The Olympics definitely accelerated the economy because there was a mad rush to get all of those infrastructure projects finished.
You're having to prepare hotels, roads, all kinds of infrastructure to make facilities for the athletes and for the visitors.
Dozens of projects were rushed through, including the monorail and high-speed train line connecting Tokyo to Osaka, a destination that didn't even have an Olympic agenda. To avoid the cost of purchasing and clearing private land to accommodate transport infrastructure, multi-lane highways were built directly over rivers and canals that were owned by the municipal government, causing an enormous amount of environmental damage.
The amount of construction going on was just raising dust all over the place. There was a negative impact, but on the whole, the 1964 Tokyo Olympics represented unprecedented progress.
Needless to say, amid the haste, there were moments of great uncertainty.
Oh my gosh, we've agreed to do this. Are we going to be able to carry this out? Will we be embarrassed in front of the rest of the world?
The majestic Olympic Stadium in Tokyo, and right from the opening ceremony, an electric feeling of excitement. The aims of the Olympic movement are to create international respect and goodwill to help to construct a better and more peaceful world.
Everything goes off very, very well, considering, and there's this great sigh of relief. And hey, we did it, you know, kind of, we're back on the world stage.
The 1964 Tokyo Olympics was a very seminal moment in Japanese history, but only 19 years after the war, Japan was pulling off arguably the most logistically complex operation. It was a chance for the Japanese to take a moment after running a marathon as if it were a sprint, to exhale and to reflect on all that they achieved. So it was a moment for the Japanese to say, we did it. We're back.
With both eyes wide open, Japan quickly became the second largest economy in the capitalist world. By 1970, the population of Greater Tokyo was in excess of 24 million. Buildings, too, were on the rise.
Japanese financial power and political power wanted to look the way power looks like. How does power look like Manhattan? So let's go high. So that is CBD. So CBD as an imported typology, as an imported expression of power. So high-rise is a turning point. This is a global city. This is a world city. This is not the capital of a defeated country. This is a capital of country which just completed successful Olympic Games.
Nishi Shinjuku was developed as an urban subcenter to take pressure off the city's traditional core. Urban planners adopted the Manhattan grid and changed building regulations, which allowed the city's skyscrapers to soar.
Tokyo has flexibility. So we didn't have Mr. Master Plan. However, we really have good flexible plan. Every year, have to make a new plan to improve the water system, air pollution management system, waste management system.
There is no planning in Tokyo which can resolve the problems of Tokyo. In Tokyo, streets have no names. And that is very interesting because when you look at Japanese addresses, they are areal. So you have the number of the block and the number of the smaller block, and inside that number of your house, and then the number of your apartment. So there are no lines.
It can make it very confusing for first-time visitors to find their way around, particularly in the more residential areas of the city. But once mastered, it makes Tokyo's public transport system look like child's play.
Public transportation in Japan is one of the best in the world, so you can easily live in Tokyo without having a car.
That's why we don't have the traffic jam, we don't have air pollution here, so this is a good thing.
The Rapid Transit Tokyo Metro, as a real-time digital animation, looks alarmingly like the mythological monster Medusa. 2,278 trains carry 6.84 million passengers a day, along 195 kilometers of track.
The Tokyo Metro has 9 lines. It's got 179 stations.
And 7 of the 20 busiest stations in the world are in Tokyo.
Shinjuku Station, every day, those people who are getting on and off, maybe 3 million, 3.8 million, something like that. It's amazing.
And there are more than 60 exits. So if you don't know where to go, you get lost.
Japan is all about systems, right? And I think it takes a while to get used to the systems, but once you get used to them, life becomes very easy.
The efficiency of every train service in Japan is legendary, conforming to a synchronized schedule which is driven by the latest computerized technology and the collective will of everyone involved. Arrival and departure times, which are set by the train drivers themselves, are actually measured in seconds.
All Japanese people like preciseness.
When bullet trains arrive at the terminus in Tokyo, they have just 12 minutes before they are turned around. 2 minutes for passengers to alight, 7 minutes for the interior to be cleaned, and 3 minutes for embarkation.
We have a 5-second margin for being on time. If we're just a little late, we have to make up for it straight away.
And you see the army of women that go into the trains to clean it up and to make sure that everything is set up for the next group. They do that in minutes, and they have to do it in minutes because the train's going to take off going the other way.
Every carriage is meant to take 150 passengers, which includes those sitting and standing. But at rush hour, we push capacity to 180%.
There are trains that are loaded to 200% capacity. You're being touched on all sides by people. You become very stressed and uncomfortable.
It's so packed that you can't move in the subway, and at the same time it's so silent, it's so quiet that you feel kind of a bit of isolation.
Depression and work-related suicides are all too common in Japan.
When analysts crunch the numbers, it turns out suicide poses a bigger threat to Tokyo's citizens than natural disasters and traffic fatalities combined.
For years, it was a problem that was ignored, though now that attitude appears to be changing.
In the past, many who wished to take their own lives threw themselves in front of trains. An act the metro has recently subdued by installing automatic safety barriers and blue lights at the end of each platform.
And these blue lights help people to relax and can help them to prevent suicide. And actually scientists are proving that actually is effective.
Equally serious social issues are brewing in Tokyo as the population ages, putting even greater pressure on the nation's rapidly diminishing workforce.
The aging workforce, which means you are becoming less productive on a per-person basis, is actually making the need for Japan to be more productive even greater.
The median age in Japan is approximately 48.4, making it the second oldest population on the planet. By 2065, 38% will be 65 or older. This could profoundly affect the nation's economic growth.
But in a strange sort of way, it's an advantage because it forces the business leaders and the government to encourage the use of technology, robotics, AI, and making their processes more productive and efficient in an economy where you don't have to lay people off. It's a labor shortage, so you don't have to worry as much as European or American companies do about implementing robotics.
Japan is also seeking to address its labor shortfall by radically changing its immigration policy.
The immigration law is changing, so it's possible actually to come and work in Japan easily.
It's a tremendous shift. This is the first time the strategically government decided to accept international workers.
New regulations target blue-collar workers and experts in specific fields of endeavor, And the government expects to accept up to 500,000 foreigners within the next 5 years.
Japan is facing this demographic crisis, population is shrinking, and so we need a breath of fresh air. We need more people to help move things forward in a positive way.
As Tokyo looks to the future, it's really starting to think outside the box, looking for new and innovative ways to build resilience across the board. It will no doubt remain a city ever on the brink of disaster, but it is doing everything in its power to stay ahead of the curve, particularly when it comes to tackling issues exacerbated by climate change.
At the present, the Tokyo metropolitan government or central government try to conquer the fear of typhoon.
Typhoons are tropical cyclones or hurricanes, and they occur with alarming regularity in Japan, showing up on the international media's radar every time the capital is hit.
Destructive nature strikes Japan again. Floods in the district round Tokyo. And this is the latest disaster. Scores drowned. And in Tokyo, one of the world's largest cities, 58,000 houses flooded.
After the Second World War, every year they had a flood caused by typhoon. So every year, more than 1,000 people were killed by typhoon.
Now, as the ocean warms, typhoons are intensifying, and so-called gorilla storms, which dump more than 100 millimeters of rain in an hour, are increasing in frequency.
It's a small scale, but it's a very severe storm.
When Typhoon Hagibis struck in 2019, the capital was paralyzed. Planes were grounded, businesses were closed, and a non-compulsory evacuation order was issued to over 6 million people. 3 Rugby World Cup matches were canceled, and 500,000 homes lost power. The economy took a $10 billion hit. And yet, as dire as it sounds, the people of Tokyo know it could have been far worse had the city been subjected to flooding.
In Tokyo, there are 2 types of threat: the severe rainfall and high tide or storm surge. If the water level becomes higher from the usual level, we cannot discharge the water inundated from small rivers to the Tokyo Bay.
Tokyo owes its vulnerability to its historic disregard for its natural drainage system, a huge mistake the city has recently redressed by artificial means.
About 100 years ago, they buried many streams or rivers in Tokyo. So the government, local government, had to construct the new type of river, artificial rivers, underground storage rivers or tunnel.
Completed in 2009, the G-Cans are a trailblazing engineering marvel, one of the most ambitious flood control systems ever installed in a city, anywhere on the planet.
They had to construct such a big tunnel under the road without stopping the traffic flow.
At 65 meters high, there's enough space in the 5 water storage silos to park an entire fleet of space shuttles, and the discharge tunnel is enormous.
The diameter of that tunnel is 12 meters, and the length is about 30 kilometers.
It's already the largest man-made drain on the planet, but once additional funding can be sourced, the project will be extended.
The Tokyo metropolitan government continuing the construction to extend the tunnel to the Tokyo Bay directly.
Until they do, however, the flood water that collects in the silos will continue to be diverted by mechanical means. 4 enormous turbines powered by jet engines that pump the water and control its release into the sea at a rate of 200,000 tons per second. A second major infrastructure rethink that's causing quite a stir concerns the generation of power. And again, this has come about because of a disaster. The magnitude 9 earthquake that struck Japan in March 2011 shifted the Earth's axis and moved the island of Honshu 2.4 meters closer to America. It produced monster waves that totally destroyed over 128,000 homes and damaged nearly 250,000 more. 16,000 people were either confirmed dead or missing.
That is a catastrophe which is beyond description and beyond understanding.
This is the main road from Fukushima into Tokyo. It's the evening rush hour, and the traffic should be going in that direction. Instead, thousands of people are trying to get out of the town and into the main city.
The ensuing 15-meter-high tsunami flooded the Daiichi nuclear power plant, crippling the diesel generators that ordinarily keep cooling equipment operational, very nearly causing a catastrophic meltdown.
Before the very famous Fukushima accident, 30% of the electric energy was coming from the nuclear power stations.
At that time, there were 54 reactors. And right now, only 9 reactors are operating.
Doubts around the safety of nuclear power are hardly a new phenomenon. But in the aftermath of an incident like Fukushima, the people of Japan have every right to be skeptical, and their government duly cautious.
Of course, we won't build new nuclear stations anymore, but they are always there.
In the rush to find a viable alternative, the government has rubber-stamped a plan to build up to 22 new coal-burning power plants.
Japan is one of the few nations that is increasing its dependency on coal.
Coal is very bad in CO2 emissions, so now we want to make a shift to natural gas, for instance.
The government says in 2030, 20 to 22% of electricity will come from nuclear power plant, but it is not reliable. Renewable should be main source. In my opinion, about 50% in 2050.
We are also simultaneously developing the sustainable energy resources like wind turbine or photoelectric energy conversion system. But the problem is such energy source cannot be the major fundamental part of the energy resource. The nuclear fusion is always a dream, but we need to keep the very fundamental, stable energy resource.
And for the time being at least, that means burning fossil fuels, even as the world galvanizes to cut carbon dioxide emissions to fight global warming. Concern for the environment is never far from the thoughts of many people living in Tokyo, particularly the youth, who are becoming increasingly conscious of their city's footprint and how it compares to the rest of the world.
I think people see Tokyo as a very high-tech, very efficient, very clean place. And I think those kinds of words and adjectives are accurate to some extent. But there's also a lot of issues that are not really part of that narrative that you often hear. And one of them is plastic consumption.
Production of plastics grew exponentially in the 1980s and early 90s, when the so-called bubble economy allowed the standard of living in Japan to soar.
So the idea is let's spend, economic growth above everything else. Consumption is a virtue.
In less than a decade, one of the most frugal societies on Earth became a nation of spendthrifts.
Japan is the second largest consumer of plastic packaging in the world after the United States. It's also one of the biggest exporters of plastic waste, which is now a very hot topic. And so the consumption of plastic here in Japan, specifically single-use plastics, is a big problem that is not necessarily getting the attention that it deserves. Sustainability is very much ingrained in the Japanese psyche, the Japanese identity. And if you look at Edo period Japan, even pre-Second World War Japan, it was a very circular society. We used to look after our resources. We used to be very good with reusing things and so on. Well, my grandma used to get very angry at me if I wouldn't finish my food. She'd say, "That's mottainai." So mottainai literally means wasteful. And so mottainai goes against some of the consumption behaviors and patterns that we see now today in Tokyo and the rest of Japan.
In 1989, during the height of the bubble economy, Tokyo produced 4.9 million tons of waste. Today, that figure has almost halved. Recycling has become a source of national pride.
In most countries, people put all the recyclable waste into one box or into one bin. But in Tokyo, people have to segregate those recyclable waste by themselves. And sometimes this kind of system is called multi-stream recycling. You have to segregate newsprints, magazines, and corrugated bottles, PET bottles, glass bottles, and steel and aluminum cans. In some places, people have to segregate those waste into more than 30 categories. Very difficult to understand.
Disposing of plastic bottles still presents a challenge, as it does for many countries and modern cities around the world.
There's about 25 billion, with a B, plastic bottles produced in Japan every single year. 25 billion. And of that 25 billion, roughly 15% are not recycled. That means they're incinerated, they're taken to landfill, or they're lost to the rivers and the oceans. And so this is a huge environmental problem that is not really being focused on.
So we have to build again in this country a new system for recycling those plastic waste. We have to change our way how we produce and how we consume plastic products.
But I think that we can regain that connection with mottainai and with traditional values that were here in Japan from many centuries ago.
For Tokyo to continue on its current trajectory, it needs to remain mindful of its past mistakes to avoid their repetition in the future. And therein lies a lesson for us all.
Japan has an opportunity to leapfrog, and I think when people come to Tokyo for the Olympics and for years to come, they will continue to see a nation becoming even more efficient and more effective.
Tokyo's success has always hinged on its prodigious capacity for reinvention, its ability to bounce back from war and natural disaster.
From natural catastrophes to social catastrophes, Tokyo has survived. It has gone through all of that, but is it going to survive its success as a global city? That is another question. I really want a bright future for this culture because it was capable to reinvent itself despite the odds.
On the surface, Tokyo is constantly changing. We have new buildings everywhere, new restaurants, cafes popping up, new fads, new fashion. But I think at a very core, deeper level, Tokyo doesn't change that much. It's still, in some ways, a very conservative society.
Even if the building itself has changed, I still can see the uniqueness of the atmosphere of Tokyo. How to say, the ambience of this Tokyo. But at the really base, I think it's never changed.
Cities are theaters for change and innovation, seats of power, and crucibles of knowledge.
You have everything here. You have everything.
They are places where people from all walks of life commute, commune, and compete.
What makes the city work well is diversity. You need a social mix and a functional mix. So if you don't have that, the city doesn't work.
That is key to urban life.
By 2050, 68% of the global population will be living in cities that are already bursting at the seams. Never before has it been so imperative to get the recipe right, to create sustainable, livable cities that inspire and excite us all.
We really try to share good solutions, even if we have different contexts.
The example of Paris is very, very interesting to be transposed to other situations.
As we race towards a more urbanized future, there is much to learn from the present and the past. From the now, the how, and the wow of building the greatest cities in the world.
No city has everything that Paris has the way Paris has it. The spectrum of what it offers is just enormous. The city of light, eternal Paris, the Paris of romance.
Within the identity of Paris, you have these other smaller cities. You can go from the Chinatown of the 13th arrondissement to Belleville. So there's this sense that you can sort of travel the world without leaving Paris.
It's very multicultural, multi-social. There is always something to do.
You want to have the best philosophical discussions, you get them. You want to have the best music, you get it. You want to spend all night having fun, you spend all night having fun.
People are beautiful in Paris, you know. The city is beautiful. That was exactly what I wanted to meet when I came in Paris. That's why I came from the deep country to Paris, because I was like, wow.
So this is Paris, the city of dreams, the irrefutable capital of culture. It's home to 297 museums, 836 theaters, 119 Michelin-starred restaurants, and it welcomes around 40 million visitors per year. It is in every sense a global city, the envy of France and the rest of the world.
Paris is seen as the big center, the administration center, the political center. The power sits in Paris. Paris decides and the rest of France follow. There is a kind of resentment or maybe jealousy from the rest of the province in France.
There really is a disequilibrium between Paris and the rest. Paris concentrates not only economic but political power, education. So for a long time the best university, all the grandes écoles were in Paris. So everything happened in Paris, which explains why you have that many people coming.
The city established its air of superiority several centuries ago, when, according to the writer Pierre de Mavereau, the rest of the earth was nothing but its suburbs.
And Paris now, what we call Paris, is really the central district, the much larger city, the Grand Paris, Greater Paris. Paris has 2.2 million inhabitants, Greater Paris, 12 million inhabitants.
Widely considered the most diverse city in Europe, 23% of the population identify as immigrants.
Already by the end of the 19th century, there was a large, almost 50,000 Italian people living in Paris. And then more people coming from the colony, the one we know today, so Algerian, Moroccans, Senegalese more recently. And so these people contributed, demographically. And of course, they contributed also in other ways, in terms of, culture. Natives of Paris have always been a minority in their own city. Migrants are the mortar, the lifeblood of the city, the people who came. And for most of its history, Paris has been what we say negative in terms of demographic. It means there was more deaths than birth. So without any contribution from outside, it would have declined and disappeared. I would say immigration has more than affected, it has built Paris.
People from beyond its borders have contributed significantly over the centuries to the brand of Paris. Frédéric Chopin, Pablo Picasso, Marie Curie. To quote Sacha Guitry, a famous French actor from Russia, being a Parisian is not about being born in Paris. It is about being reborn there.
Paris, the soul of France, the city of culture. Paris, the city where people of every class know how to enjoy their leisure. Paris, the city of fashion and wealth, where past and present mix in colorful parade.
When you live in Paris, you live with history. I think maybe even more so than in other major capital cities around the globe. The presence of history is there on every block.
Now, Paris is a city which has a tremendous power of expression. It's a long history, more than 1,000 years.
There is proof of settlement from even prehistorical time. What we know about it is when the Romans start to mention the city of Lutèce, which was one of the cities of the Galit tribe that were living nearby, the Parisi, so hence the name.
When the Romans conquered the Parisi in 52 AD, the settlement was not particularly significant.
So there were a lot of very important cities at the Roman time, and Paris was very small, probably like 10,000 inhabitants at most.
Much smaller, for example, than Lyon in France, or Marseille in the south, which were bigger cities at the time. So small city, but in a very good location, and I think the geographical location of Paris is very important to understand its development, past and present, and maybe future development. Because Paris stands in the middle of a kind of plain, very fertile, with a forest, also a good diversity, with the river Seine. So a good situation, and the fact that you could cross easily the Seine River because of the presence of islands in the river, in fact, explain the settlement of the first village, and then the Roman city on the left bank of Paris.
The population grew considerably during the Middle Ages, as did the stature of the city, rising in importance as the Kingdom of France was formed.
Ile-de-France and the Kingdom of Ile-de-France grew little by little, absorbing its neighbors, fighting against the Normans.
And by 1800, it was 500,000 strong, forming one of the largest cities in Europe.
So this expansion has been marked also by different walls of fortifications built like a circle. First one around the island of Cité, the island in Paris, and then other one, Philippe Auguste, and then Charles V. And then the last one being built in 1841.
The wall of the Farmers General, built in the 1780s, proved the exception to the rule.
The Paris city limits being the one designed in around 1780. With just a wall, not really a fortification, but only a wall for a tax reason, where you could pay a tax when you would enter in Paris with some goods or export goods from Paris. And this was the city limits still in 1850s. 500,000 people in 1800, 1 million in 1850, 2 million in 1870. So a very fast expansion. It's a kind of explosion, which of course was really pushed forward the need for refurbishment, restructuration of the city.
To build Paris, each generation exploited the city's abundant natural resources, quarrying the limestone and gypsum that was quite literally beneath their feet.
And what happened is that by the 18th century, it was really like a Swiss cheese. So there was a lot of, underground holes everywhere, and people started to worry. So you could have a big hole under your house, you don't even know that it's there. So by the end of the 18th century, they created a committee designed to map, organize, and consolidate these quarries. Another parallel issue or problem was the bodies of the dead. You don't meet the living and the dead. And this was also probably good for sanitary conditions and so on. The problem is that as the city expanded, it started to absorb what were former cemeteries. And by the 18th century, there were more than 200 of them, small cemeteries of various size. Near each church, there was a cemetery.
The newly dead were often stacked on top of older graves, a practice that was neither safe nor sanitary, eventually leading to some rather alarming collapses.
There was a restaurant where the wall collapsed and tons of bodies and bones were there in the middle of the restaurant. So all this had become an issue, and they decided to kill two birds with one stone by putting the bones of the previous dead in the former quarries. It's what became known as the catacombs that you can visit, and it's very touristy. I mean, it's very popular with people.
So you can see these catacombs, which are installed in part of the quarry. In fact, the quarry developed with several levels, with a kind of a maze of tunnels, which bear the names of the streets which are above. So if you have a good map, you can walk for a certain number of kilometers. You can even get lost. So it's really a kind of unknown city underground, which is now kind of part of the attraction of tourists in Paris.
The plague was a frequent visitor to Paris during the 16th and 17th centuries. But the city owes its underground drainage system, and to some extent its beautiful broad boulevards, to a devastating outbreak of cholera in 1832.
Life expectancy was very much lower in Paris than in the rest of France, because at the time Paris was very dirty, a very poor condition of life.
Overpopulation and industrialization had left Paris in a state of squalor. People threw their sewage into gutters that ran down the middle of the street, a practice that exacerbated the spread of the disease.
And so the idea was to really give Paris a proper hygienic system. The sewage water flowed downstream to the west of Paris and be used as a kind of fertilizer for fields downstream Paris. Provide food for the Parisians.
By the 1840s, the issue of hygiene was already integral to the evolving urban plan of the city. Key streets had been widened, their gutters relocated, and sidewalks designed and installed.
All over the city, from Saint-Cloud to Montparnasse, from Place d'Italie to Belleville, are the signs of a frenzied building boom. They add up to the biggest urban renewal program since the 1850s, when Baron Haussmann tore up the medieval city and laid the foundations of modern Paris.
The radical change came around the 1850s. A man, Eugène Haussmann, started to implement a radical change for transforming Paris, for changing Paris from a middle-aged city into a modern city.
19,730 buildings would ultimately be demolished to make way for one of the most extensive voluntary public works programs in European history.
The city at the time was rather small, maybe the 1st district in Paris. And in 1860, this was extended to the limit of the wall, which marked the actual physical limit of Paris.
So this extension really changed the face of the city, because it included a lot of very poorest part of the city. So the area where people were not wealthy enough to live within Paris, within the walls of Paris, were included.
To say that the redevelopment of Paris was way ahead of its time is nothing short of an understatement. Indeed, there are many European cities of a similar vintage shackled to their medieval street plans.
Haussmann wanted to make the city level cleaner, proper, better looking, and the same was true for the underground. So they made large sewers where you could travel, you could walk. And it was something relatively common for the bourgeoisie, you know, they were very nicely dressed. They would go down in the sewers on small boats, walking on, you can imagine what it was, so water mixed with all kind of bad stuff.
Only the French could romanticize a sewer and turn it into an attraction, revealing what Haussmann himself described as the internal organs of the city, where secretions are mysteriously performed and public health maintained without disturbing the running of the city or spoiling its beauty.
But at the beginning of the 19th century, you had like 15 kilometers of sewers, all in Paris. To give you an idea, today it's like 2,000. And most of these 2,000 were built all over the 19th century.
Each sewerage tunnel beneath the city mirrors the street above, complete with blue and white enameled signs and numbered plaques identifying the outflow from individual buildings. Haussmann also commissioned reservoirs and aqueducts to bring clean water to the city and linked new train terminals with his signature avenues.
So there was some ideas that were important for the development of the city. So helping the circulation of people, of goods, of things through the cities, and also helping the circulation of soldiers. So if you have a revolution, you want to be able to crush it more easily, so you need to have this very big, large avenue, which were one of the trademarks of Haussmann.
The idea of Haussmann was to not only to create new streets, but also to have these streets constructed at once with new buildings, following very strict regulation in height, in typologies, to ensure there was not a uniformity. All the buildings are different, but in fact a very strong homogeneity in the image of the city.
There was supposed to be a proportionality between the width of the streets and the height of the building, in order not to cut too much light into the street itself. And the floors were organized socially. So the first floor was the floor for the most wealthiest, because there was no elevator at the time.
Typical, that we call now Haussmannian building. It's 5 stories high with maybe 1 or 2 stories in the roof, with a stone facade, with a roof in zinc and so on. So that was a way to give a distinctive look at Paris, while at the same time creating this new infrastructure of streets.
Around the same time Haussmann was beginning to implement his city-wide rebuild, the first department store opened in Paris, heralding a retail revolution.
It's really this incredible turning point in the history of consumption. That's also one of the legacies of Paris in a way. Fashion was one of the first industries to become mechanized. And so if you're able to mechanize the production of fabrics, if you're able to mechanize the act of sewing, well, the next step in a way is to sort of industrialize the process of consumption. And so the city reflects this in scale. You enter the store and you're overwhelmed with all the different products that there are. They were spaces where women could exist socially in the city, and they became these destinations. This was the genius behind invention of the department store in the mid-19th century.
Designed by Gustave Eiffel, Le Bon Marché was quickly followed by other iconic stores that adopted the same commercial philosophy: La Samaritaine, Galeries Lafayette, and Printemps. Together, they helped create a new religion of consumerism that venerated beauty and fashion.
Fashion industry in Paris is huge, and it's been this way for centuries. Historians generally say that fashion appears as invented, sometimes in the middle of the 14th century. It's a moment when people start renewing their clothes cyclically for no apparent reason. And from this very beginning, from this moment, Paris plays a central role in the very idea of what fashion is.
Well, this is where it all began, in Paris, where the backroom boys decide just how long a skirt should be. It seems that if skirts are long today, they have to be shorter tomorrow.
It's not just garments, it's the music, it's the architecture, it's the way people would behave, talk. Fashion is a much bigger idea. So Paris played a role within this context, not just producing new garments, but contributing to a new attitude, a new lifestyle, and it has done for centuries. Historically, French people have always been admired for their style, for being forward-thinking in terms of sartorial decisions, in terms of taste.
The industry and culture of fashion are integral to the past, present, and future vitality of Paris.
Jean-Baptiste Colbert said that fashion should be to France, and so to Paris, what the gold mines of Peru are to Spain. So this idea that it was sort of an endless source of wealth, and that if you were able to organize it, if you were able to understand how to profit from it, it would be a never-ending source of wealth and a great trigger for the economy, really.
Contributing significantly to the image of the city and its enduring popularity.
Paris has had this ability to welcome foreigners, and this is what really made its fashion so powerful. This idea that you would visit Paris through its stores as much as you would visit Paris through its monuments and museums. It's a financial and economical mechanism. Fashion originates in Paris, it grows.
The French fashion industry, together with the wider net it casts, employs around 1 million people and generates 2.7% of the nation's GDP. Over 300 fashion shows are held in the country each year, but Paris Fashion Week eclipses them all. A driving force in the Parisian economy, its shows and associated events generate over 400 million euros per year.
So the importance of Paris Fashion Week is fundamental for the economy of the city, but it goes far beyond. It's really about claiming a part of the national French identity.
Department stores went hand in glove with the Haussmannization of Paris. Indeed, several of the largest stores still dominate the boulevard named in his honor. It's ironic that the final section of that particular roadway was the last of Haussmann's visionary schemes to be realized, long after he'd passed away.
And we must credit also Napoleon III for that. A very clear view and anticipation of the city in 20, 30, 50 years.
And Haussmann also made our city very dense. The city was already dense before, but he invented a model where density was acceptable.
Within the city limits, there are over 21,000 people per square kilometer.
Density is sometimes a big word because people say, I don't want density. But actually, in Paris, you realize that's what makes a city ecological and what makes a city walkable and what makes a city nice. We don't have to heat too many buildings because when you live close to each other, like you share the heat and you can walk everywhere. So it was very smart.
Haussmann's legacy included 34,000 new buildings and 27 new parks and squares, 100,000 trees, and countless pieces of street furniture.
The street being treated like a room, like a kind of luxury room even.
Featuring benches, newspaper stands, railings, and lampposts, many of which still exist in the Parisian landscape today.
Haussmann had a huge impact on the aesthetics and the identity of Paris. Like when you say Paris, people have two images, the Eiffel Tower and the Haussmannian building. So it shows how urban planning can leave a strong heritage.
When the average tourist thinks of Paris, what images spring most immediately to mind? The Eiffel Tower, certainly, a dominating feature of the city for nearly 100 years, in which time it's become the very symbol of Paris.
The Eiffel Tower is, without a doubt, the most iconic building in Paris, an architectural triumph constructed to wow the crowds at the 1889 World Fair.
The Eiffel Tower is a kind of emblem to show to the world the power of the French industry.
Universal Exposition at the time where important empires and cities to proclaim themselves to the world, to the main global power that were competing for space and visibility at the time.
Towering more than 300 meters above Paris, Eiffel's masterpiece was, at the time, the tallest structure in the world. A gigantic Meccano-like tower with over 18,000 components, held together with 2.5 million rivets. Taking just over 2 years to complete, it was an extraordinary demonstration of French engineering and a defining moment of the industrial era.
It's a bit of a paradox. Paris is a very horizontal city, built in stone, with gray zinc roofs. And then you have suddenly this iron structure, very industrial looking, very typical of the 19th century iron architecture, standing up and becoming a symbol of the city.
It's an incarnation of the Industrial Revolution, if you want, and a visible symbol of this.
So very quickly built, in time for the 1989 big exhibition, where it became, of course, instantly world attraction.
Besides being one of the sights of Paris and a great place for tourists to visit, the tower is also used for scientific observations and a radio station. How'd you like to have an area like that in your backyard?
Blitzkrieg had broken. Inadequately supplied poilus engulfed. In a matter of days, civilian France was at the mercy of a power-crazed madman.
When the Germans captured Paris during World War II, the French cut the lift cables in Eiffel's Tower, forcing Hitler's soldiers to climb the steps in order to secure their flag to the mast, a symbolic gesture that reduced many in the city to tears.
And it was a kind of re-humiliation, so this idea of having foreign troops occupying the city and moving through the Champs-Élysées.
Nazi rule had commenced. Death for those who opposed. Liberation was on the way.
Germany's occupation was short-lived. Paris was liberated in 1944, and thanks to General Dietrich von Choltitz, many of its landmarks were spared, despite Hitler's orders to the contrary.
The Paris area, now some 8 million strong, is likely to double its population by the year 2000. Outside Paris, new flats are being rushed up, and 100,000 dwellings a year is the plan.
After the Second World War, we had a very fast expansion in terms of housing being built.
Not so much in the heart of the city, but in its surrounding suburbs, leading to the creation of large social housing estates.
Maybe 1/3 of the French people had a new apartment or a new house. So that's really a huge effort to catch up with what has not been done in between World War I and World War II. We had a few suburbs around, let's say 800,000 people living in the suburbs of Paris in 1910. In 1960, 6 million people living outside. So a very fast expansion, and in 1958, they decided to create new towns, 5 new towns around Paris, to try to consolidate the urbanization in specific kind of sub-centers to the city.
La Défense was established in this period too, on the historical axis extending from the Louvre through the Champs-Élysées and Arc de Triomphe.
All over the city, new tower blocks have risen, equaling Manhattan in their devotion to straight lines and glass frontages. Paris is undergoing a massive redevelopment. And the trend is not just outwards, but upwards.
So the idea behind La Défense was to have one business hub outside of Paris and to have the skyscrapers there, which is quite an interesting idea because it helped us keep the identity of the center of Paris.
Today, La Défense is the largest purpose-built business district in Europe. It boasts over 3 million square meters of office space utilized by 1,500 companies that employ 180,000 people, most of whom commute into the district to work.
Now the problem with La Défense is that it's a bit monofunctional area, and now we know that people want mixed areas with housing, with leisure. So that's the big challenge of La Défense for the future.
There is a lot of resistance to the easy solution high-rise buildings offer when space becomes limited for development. in the city center and its surrounding suburbs, where the alternative is urban sprawl.
High-rise buildings do not have a strong legitimacy in terms of social life. Or La Défense even, it's okay, because it's a cluster, it's something which is really takes its value from the fact that not only one tower is there, but a group of towers. Okay, and it expresses maybe power of business or the power of the economy, okay. But I think we should live on more horizontal cities.
As the urban form of Paris continues to evolve away from its Haussmannian hub, there is strong support for plans to completely transform its edges. Building a more cohesive, sustainable society by addressing, once and for all, the tension that exists between the city proper and the banlieue, the outlying and less reputable residential areas of Paris.
Historically, Paris has always been a city of two sides, if you want. All this working class has been moved from the center up to the periphery. One of the great challenge for the city in the coming decades is to break these boundaries. And this is probably what the Grand Paris, so Great Paris project, is about.
The idea is simply to organization between Paris and the cities around, to travel faster from one city to another and to have the same quality of life. Because we don't want like a center Paris where you could walk everywhere and with nice buildings, and then suburbs which would not have the same quality of life.
Historically, the center of Paris has been administered by a single political unit. The banlieue, however, is governed by over 1,000. A situation that has frequently led to poor coordination and communication between the city proper and its outliers. A situation the Grand Paris Project is hoping to address.
Paris, a city that's changing faster and more profoundly than any other European capital. Since 1962, over 250,000 people have moved out of central Paris in search of peace and quiet.
Paris is a mix of small villages. We have 17 districts in the city. Paris is very small compared to, for example, Berlin or London. So I think it's really important to develop that bigger identity, to say that Paris is not only inside the ring road. So we really have this challenge to change our collective identity and to make it a bit bigger, so that there is not this huge gap between Paris and the outskirts anymore. We really want people to discover places which are outside of Paris. There are really great places of history, and nobody goes just because it's outside of Paris.
All inhabitants, even people living 10 kilometers from Paris, should feel as belonging also to Paris.
To ease the disparity between the city and its suburbs, many Parisians believe the ring road must change.
Parisians affectionately call their ring road Le Périph', short for Le Périphérique. It may have lightened central Paris traffic, but it's also loud, smelly, and a barrier between the capital and the suburbs.
It is like a symbolic wall. Nobody would dream of taking a walk through the Boulevard Périphérique. It's a different world out there. I don't think you find anything comparable in any of the other world cities, something where you have this chasm between the relatively affluent center and the less affluent periphery.
Boulevard Périphérique is one of the most congested highways in Europe. A 35-kilometer concrete belt around the city that is utilized by over 1 million vehicles every day.
The ring road, the Périphérique, is all around Paris, and it's particular because it's very close to the center as compared to other cities in the world, so it creates a lot of pollution, and it creates a huge physical and psychological barrier between Paris and the other cities. And so we really have to change it into more like an avenue, so where you could have more trees and maybe less road, and also space for like buses or bikes, and nice spaces to cross more easily between Paris and the suburbs.
It may seem like a counterintuitive move, lowering the speed limit and removing lanes from the highway to lessen congestion, and the plan certainly has its critics. But the bigger point of contention is whether or not altering the ring road will change the attitude of Paris.
Even in the congested streets of the capital, the private automobile is first choice as a means of transport. There was, of course, a price to be paid: noise, dirt, and an overall increase in urban blight.
I know that taxpayers' money is being spent on paying people to think about this. But no, the reality is that it's unlikely to happen, at least in my lifetime. Paris will remain the 20 arrondissement for quite some time.
For the Grand Paris project to successfully carry the city into its foreseeable future, there needs to be a complete rethink around the whole issue of transportation, not just the boulevard périphérique.
Although the city is losing more and more of its population to the suburbs, the vast majority of jobs remain in town, and that means a twice-daily rush hour of enormous proportions.
Paris, like many cities in the world, at one point of its history has been dedicated to cars. And so that's how we ended up with a highway close to the Seine River. That's how we ended up with a lot of highways. I think now it's something recognized in urban planning that cities should not be designed around cars. But since it's about infrastructures, it's very heavy to change. You cannot change it in one day or in 1 year. But it's also hard to change because it's about people's habits.
In Western European countries, private car was considered as a symbol of liberty and independence. So for Paris region, let's say during the 1960s, there was very few investment in public transport and a high rate of car ownership.
Traffic jams and parking meters created a deterrent, but by far the biggest incentive not to drive in the center of Paris came with improvements to the metro in the early 70s.
It runs from the Place de la Nation in Paris, this brand new Metro Express. Jet Set certainly expresses the quality of travel on the new Metro. Trains cover this first 20-kilometer section at an average of over 60 miles an hour.
In 1900, the first metro line was built in Paris, giving Paris a very dense metro system, very efficient, with very close distance from one station to another, about 600 meters.
Today, the metro has 219 kilometers of line, servicing more than 300 stations, and it is used by 1.8 billion travelers per year.
But our problem is that this network is almost entirely inside the city of Paris. And so the people who live in the suburbs, most of them don't have access to the direct subway.
It increases the contrast between Paris and the outside of Paris.
If you want to move from one point in the suburb to another point that may be very next, you may have to go through Paris and then back again, so it takes you a lot of time.
The Grand Paris Express will address this anomaly, but it won't be fully operational until 2030.
The metro system in Paris is about 200 kilometers, so it's kind of doubling the metro.
And it will really change the life of millions of people who live in the suburbs. So now it's the biggest transportation project in Europe. It's really a huge project.
The project will see 200 kilometers of new track added and 68 stations opened, requiring an estimated investment of $43 billion US.
Building subways is great, but then you also have to improve the quality of life in very different ways. So it's about creating parks, about creating bike lanes everywhere, not only in the center of Paris. car sharing is very important also, because if everybody was car sharing, we would have like 3 times less cars. So it's also a solution. We will really have to adapt our city to the new climate, to new ecological challenges, and keep our identity, but make it less hot, make it more fresh, and adapt it. Our buildings, our streets, to show that this is compatible with ecology, with also parks and trees.
We have to be more bicycle, we have to be more green, we have to be more social. And it's changed a lot so fast just because one people decide that Paris should be more in its time.
The more people you have in a well-designed city, the higher the concentration, the less emissions of greenhouse gases there are per head of population. If you live in the sticks, you have to do 20 kilometers in your car to buy a loaf of bread. If you live in Paris, you walk 100 yards. It's, well, what is the better solution in terms of global warming? It's pretty obvious that it isn't to put people out in the sticks. World cities are actually the vanguard solution to global warming, more so than the problem.
Mitigating the impact of climate change is now on every urban planner's agenda, due in small part to the Paris Agreement ratified in 2016. But of equal concern to many cities around the world is the threat of terrorism.
Security remains tight following 3 days of violence that began here at the offices of Charlie Hebdo and left 20 people dead, 17 victims plus the 3 attackers. The terror spree has been linked to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
9/11 in New York, 7/7 in London, the assassination of most of the editorial board of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical weekly.
The Eiffel Tower closed on Saturday for a day of mourning in Paris following the deadliest attack on French soil since World War II. The attacks killed 129 people and left hundreds injured.
And later in the year, we had the massive assault rifle and explosive attacks against a number of targets in and around Paris. Close to 300 people were killed in France, mostly in Paris, by jihadi terrorists. And to put it in their own words, they went after Paris because Paris is Paris.
Paris's days of terror ended in gunfire and explosions in 2 locations Friday.
The soldiers of Allah took as their target the capital of abominations and perversion, the one which holds up the banner of the cross in Europe, Paris.
A day after more than 1 million people, including some 40 world leaders, embarked on Paris for a unity rally honoring last week's terror attack victims, France is mobilizing its security forces to protect a nation on edge.
The jihadis tend to go for big city targets, not only because you can move around fairly easily in a big city, but because they are the hubs of power, the hubs of wealth, and the hubs of whatever ideology or thinking or politics are being made in the countries where these cities are located.
Unfortunately, we're kind of used to this, but life is life, and life continues. Life goes on. So they can do this again and again and again. We'll be here. We will never give up.
When explaining why they had gunned down more than 130 people, they say hundreds of idolaters were assembled there in a feast of perversion. So their vision of Paris was, in a way, extraordinarily accurate, that it is a place where people assemble to enjoy themselves, to live a life of freedom. This is what they were attacking. And this is what they wanted to destroy.
The best way to fight against these people is to show absolutely no fear.
Paris was shocked to the core, compelled to enhance its security despite the risk of inflaming religions' divisions and scarring the picture-perfect appeal of the eternal city for life. A $40 million bulletproof glass security fence was installed around the iconic Eiffel Tower, inciting many Parisians to object on the grounds that it presented not just a physical barrier within their beloved city, but a philosophical and psychological one as well.
Paris has lost part of its charm, part of its poetry. Things that's usually kind of harder now in terms of circulation, parking, security, density of people, but more than that, in relation from people between each other. You don't have this same feeling as you had before. And of course, the events of with the terrorist attack have even maybe enhanced the feeling of uneasiness in terms of security and the uniqueness of Paris, the kind of exceptionality of Paris, if we can say. The fact that it is really the best place in the world is challenged now by other places. It has to retain this quality because it's really part of what of the quality of life in Paris is really also connected to that, to this feeling of being really in a very, very nice place. It's a very nice city still, but it has to improve.
This is a feeling echoed by many people living within the metropolis, but it's not necessarily one that's shared by the legion of tourists who still hold Paris in the highest regard, who still feel connected to the touchstones of Paris, and thus the narrative of humankind.
We certainly had questions of security, of wondering what was going to be happening, what happened in London, what happened in Paris, what has happened all over the world. Yes, but that didn't mean we stopped.
The world is a beautiful place. Everyone's friendly. There's a few maniacs out there. That's not going to change the way that we operate.
When we had the terrible fire at Notre Dame in April 2019, the outpourings of empathy, compassion, etc. around the world were extraordinary. To do this kind of stuff in reaction to the place which Paris occupies in the minds of people. This is a form of, in French we talk about l'hommage que le vice rend à la vertu, the homage which vice proffers to virtue. This is the power of Paris.
Culture and heritage have always allowed Paris to distinguish itself from the pack. But increasingly, the city is turning heads as it takes on the challenges of the 21st century. Globalization, gentrification, modernization, and more.
Some people have an image of Paris which is only about history, so really Eiffel Tower and Haussmann. But I think more and more people are understanding that what we are trying to do in Paris is very courageous, changing the rules of the game of urban planning in Paris. If we don't fight for regulation, for social housing, then cities have a risk of becoming homogeneous because of affordability. So, that's our big challenge, is to keep difference and diversity in the city. We know that what makes the city work well is diversity. And you need a social mix and a functional mix. So if you don't have that, the city doesn't work.
There's this idea that Paris has to be preserved as the Paris of the 19th century. What is the space that Paris can give a younger generation? And so how do you exist in a landscape that is so influenced and very much built, structured around this idea of historical legacy?
That's really the challenge, to show that modernity and history can be combined. And showing that this can be done in Paris is also a big message of hope for other cities. We can be a good symbol for changes in urban planning.
Cities are theaters for change and innovation, seats of power and crucibles of culture.
A city is like a kind of a dream catcher.
They are places where people from all walks of life commute, commune, and compete.
Our capital cities are really distinct and memorable places where people come together to live the good life.
By 2050, 68% of the global population will be living in cities that are already bursting at the seams, or moving into others that are yet to be conceived.
One of the problems with any city that has a thriving economy is that there is constant pressure for change, pressure for development.
And cities have just ballooned in size over the 20th century.
Never before has it been so imperative to get the recipe right, to create sustainable, livable cities that inspire and excite us all.
We're not only building high, we're also building wide. It's not just a question of density, it's a question of urbanity. Why can't we make new cities in Australia? We're the only country with a whole continent.
As we race towards a more urbanized future, there is much to learn from the present and the past. From the now, the how, and the wow of building the greatest cities in the world.
Oh my God, this place, it's so sexy.
It's exciting, it's diverse, kind of a cross between a high-class hooker and a country matron.
I love the history of Sydney. I mean, the harbour's great. But what I love about Sydney is what I think of as its ancient, messed up, crooked little heart. So you get all these convicts who came here with no education and no skills and no money and no sense of a future. They had a whole continent to play with. And what do? They build these kind of squashed up little streets and squashed up little houses and squashed up little lives because they were desperate to get back into the huddle of deprivation that they were used to. And I think that is so charming. I just think the pathos of that is so touching and so sweet and so kind of funny in a sad way.
Sydney is the biggest city in Australia. Before Queen Victoria's Day, Sydney hardly existed at all. Yet today, 1 out of every 5 Australians comes from here.
So this is Sydney, a global city proudly marching to the beat of its own drum. Its heart is this magnificent 55 square kilometer harbor, and its soul, the 5.3 million people who are fortunate enough to call Greater Sydney home.
Sydney was established as a penal settlement, as a place to send convicted criminals from England. They were sent to Australia as a means of hardship.
It's a unique story to Sydney. It actually puts down roots into the story of the city.
Outward-looking and forward-thinking, yet shackled to its convict past, Sydney is a work in progress, constantly reinventing itself in its own image, breaking all the rules, and more often than not, swimming against the tide.
Most people think about Sydney and they probably think about convicts. But of course, Sydney's history goes back much further. I like to say that Sydney is a modern city with an ancient heartbeat. And that heartbeat is Aboriginal people.
Historically, if you go back, there's evidence of Aboriginal populations in Sydney for around 30,000 years.
It's difficult to know how many Aboriginal people were living in the broader Sydney metropolitan area at the time of the British invasion, since so many were wiped out by the colonists, or the smallpox they brought with them before any census was done. But historians suggest they numbered in their thousands.
Circular Quays seemed to be a place where they came together, and it was an obvious place for the Europeans to settle. Why was that? Because it had fresh water, it had the tank stream. It was a bay that faced north. It received the sea breeze. It had shores that went down quite deep so that ships could moor quite near the shore, but a sandy bed.
The tank stream, which you don't even know is there, it's like the secret river, which runs from the town hall underground all the way down to the quay. which is really beautiful.
It was this nirvana in a sense, and it was well appreciated by the Indigenous people and instantly seen by Governor Phillip when he arrived here as a perfect place for settlement.
What we see is water really directing where the settlement establishes, where the penal colony goes. We quickly see that alongside this place of punishment, we get a maritime port developing. And so there's whaling and there is sealing, and they're critical industries for Sydney in its very early days.
There were formal plans laid out for Sydney in 1788, but they were largely unsuitable given the terrain and overriding imperative to meet the immediate needs of the settlement, which consisted of around 850 convicts and the Marine guards and officers charged with overseeing their care and labor.
I think it's fair to say that Sydney can be regarded in many ways an accidental city right up until the late 19th century. And we can see that in the way the streets respond a lot more to the topography rather than any sort of formal grid line.
And that's been a big thing in Sydney's development, is the relation of the city grids to the very strong underlying topography.
A lot of the roads developed from early paths. George Street and Pitt Street and Elizabeth Street, that's why they all sort of diverged.
Forest Road and Oxford Street follow the ridge. They're almost certainly Aboriginal tracks.
Even the route from Sydney to Parramatta basically follows the line of what was very likely to have been a route that the Indigenous people took from Sydney to Parramatta, because it was essentially along a ridge, parallel to the water.
Those early plans of Sydney show convicts on the left, on the west, and the redcoats and the governor on the right, and that's still western suburbs and eastern suburbs. Still a class line that's drawn, and they're sort of divided by the tank stream.
Most of the early settlement was up on the western side of what is now Circular Quay, up in the rocks.
Of course, it's called the Rocks because it had rock.
A lot of Sydney's buildings are built out of sandstone. They're built out of country. It gives a certain colour to the city. It has a gorgeous yellow colour that honeys over time and really glows in the Sydney sunlight.
It's a geological specificity of Sydney, and it's given the whole city so much character.
We can look at those marks on the Argyle Cut, which the convicts made with their, rock hammers or whatever they were using. And you can think, oh my God, look at this. That would have taken how long? Months, years, pain, misery. And so that sense of empathy to have been you, back 200 years ago, I can feel that. And that's good for us. It makes us better people.
One of the really interesting things about many convicts in Sydney is that while there were some gangs and leg irons and all of that, there were also a lot of convicts that were just assigned to be servants, to be assigned to masters to help them with their businesses. And once they'd done the hours required of them, they could then go and work on their own business. They could grow their own vegetables and sell them if they wanted. And they started building their own little huts and started creating their own businesses.
Despite London's near constant interference, the town grew of its own, rather haphazard volition.
The City of Sydney is formed in 1842. The colonial government decides that it's worthwhile to push off some of the more difficult nitty-gritty things like dealing with rubbish and dealing with roads and trying to provide sanitation for the town, and so they introduce municipal government. The first elections happen at a local government level, and a council of worthy men and even a couple of former convicts come around and form the first council, and they have to literally try to work out how to deal with everything that a growing city needs.
Planning for infrastructure is a complicated issue for any city council, but in Sydney, it was doubly problematic.
being halfway around the world and trying to set up manufacturing to actually support the building of infrastructure, all these sort of things really challenged the early colonists and the municipal council. So one of the key things that the council had to do right at the very start was to deal with sanitation, so sewerage and water.
So the history of sewage starts pretty much where the history of drinking water starts, at the tank stream. In order to make that supply more reliable, they actually dug rectangular tanks into the sandstone to store water. The tank stream became an unofficial sewer by the 1830s. It was an official sewer when we first built our first formal sewage systems in the late 1850s. And those sewers just discharged raw, untreated wastewater straight into Sydney Harbour. Towards the end of the 1800s, we developed what was called the Botany Sewage Farm. And then later on came the Bondi sewage system, which is what drained a lot of the city's wastewater. So instead of discharging that raw sewage into Sydney Harbour, we were discharging it off a cliff face at Bondi.
As ill-conceived as the earliest sewerage system sounds, it pales in comparison to the council's method of distributing water across the colony.
Some of the first pipes that were laid in Sydney were actually lead pipes, which of course we now know for drinking water is not such a good idea, can lead to lead poisoning.
The first council was sacked after little more than a decade. Their successors, keen not to make the same mistakes twice, commissioned a survey of Sydney that would better inform the development of the city.
This trigonometrical survey of Sydney went from 1855 through to 1865, and it's our first accurate survey of Sydney. And we can see where the water pipes were going, where the drainage was happening. And this is the very start of, I guess, rather than being haphazard planning, but actually starting to really plan our infrastructure for Sydney.
The timing of the survey was serendipitous, as Sydney's fortunes were about to turn, significantly increasing the size of its population.
If we go through the decades, 1840s, we've got end of transportation, we've got a depression. The 1850s, we see gold being discovered in New South Wales. And so that really brings a big influx of population in and also money into the colony. Through the 1860s, we actually start to see the start of an economic boom. And that lasts through until the 1890s. And so we see Sydney growing and transforming from being a penal colony to going into a Georgian town, and then really blossoming into what we call the Victorian period. And it really shines out that Sydney at that time was the port of the South.
Australia's tramway system started back in 1861. Even when the horses lost a shoe or two, the passengers still arrived on time.
Public transport became another nightmare Sydney's forebears had to contend with, the black sheep of the infrastructure family that's managed to haunt every generation since.
There's a transport plan through to 2056. It's far too weak. It completely lacks ambition, and we need to be building public transport on a scale that's 3 and 4 times that envisaged in that plan. We need lots of modes.
Currently, the 813-kilometer hybrid urban-suburban rail system has 8 lines servicing 175 stations. Its annual ridership is in excess of 413 million. The most recent extension to the light rail has boosted its capacity to 3 lines and 42 stations.
It's great we've got a metro, it's great that we've got light rail, but we need to use them with heavy rail above, and buses, and then pedestrians and cycling. We need an integration of them in a way that we used to do very well. Sydney actually was a great public transport city, and so up to the construction of the Harbour Bridge, we had one of the biggest tram systems in the world. We had a railway system with very high patronage, we had ferries that were booming, and we had interchange between them all. So we had a walking city that intersected with a public transport city.
The thing about public transport is that it structures the city on corridors. So the railways, in a sense, extended the radiating pattern of the old country roads. And that's where the city then followed the railways and the tramways. The hub of the entire railway system is Central Station, which is also a stop on the latest 12-kilometer light rail line that runs from Circular Quay to Randwick.
Well, there's lots of challenges because they're running it up George Street. It's the oldest urban street in Australia, so it was full of surprises.
Central Railway Station was actually built on one of Sydney's early cemeteries, the Devonshire Street cemeteries. That was in use from 1820 through to the 1860s. The government did clear it, but what we discover is that the bodies keep popping up, and they came up again during the most recent infrastructure works around Central Station.
When Sydney's last tram made its last journey through the city, Aussies gave it a great farewell. They packed themselves on board and they lined the route, so the tram had a rattling good send-off. Business was brisker than it had been for years. But trams are now a thing of the past. In 1961, it's the age of speed, so get a move on, Sydney!
There are people living in Sydney who can remember being on trams, and it just made perfect sense back then to get rid of them to make room for cars, and now it makes perfect sense to get rid of cars and put light rail in.
Light rail is different than tram, basically in terms of the scale. Running on track that's the same gauge, they're running with the same kind of overhead or in-ground wires, and it's just that trams had an old-fashioned ring to it, and light rail sounded modern back in the 1970s and 80s when people coined the word. It has exclusive right-of-way in most places, but it crosses at grade, which means that it has to stop at traffic signals. And when it's running up George Street, it's in a pedestrian zone, so it runs slower because there's a lot of pedestrians about. This idea of the light rail running down George Street, it's a bit oversized, really. And if you look at the old pictures of George Street, there'd be trams running down George Street, but they'd be much smaller vehicles, and there'd be many more of them. It'd be much more frequent.
As the rail and tram lines of yesteryear continued to extend their reach, the city of Sydney grew beyond its urban core.
These suburbs start developing up around certain train stations and also along the tram lines. So Newtown really flourishes. Petersham really flourishes in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And supported by this infrastructure development, municipal government broadens out.
If you look at the city centre, if you came here in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, it was predominantly terrace houses. Don't have that many grander rows of terraces. We tend to have smaller terraces. Of course, we've added the verandas. They're very efficient terraces. Developers and builders in the 19th century loved them because you could just pack them in, make them narrower.
Verandas were never a big thing in England, but they become so much more important in Australia to reduce heat, create outdoor living areas, that type of thing.
And so by the early 20th century, Sydney really is a city of suburbs. And there are growing little local areas and individual councils and businesses all happening in the suburbs, but still this really strong transport network that comes back to the centre of the city.
In the early 1900s, ferries were still the most expedient way to travel between the north and south sides of the harbour. But all that was about to change with the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
So the bridge was this great project that was talked about for centuries.
There are fantastic drawings in the State Library of early tunnels proposed, many bridge forms proposed, and it's only until enough political pressure and enough money's available to be able to build the Harbour Bridge.
Our Treasury argued against the bridge for decades, just like they argue against all sorts of sensible infrastructure today.
The government eventually bit that bullet, approved the steel arch design, and greenlit its construction.
It used local skills, but also brought in some technology from overseas.
Building commenced in 1925, so right in the middle of the roaring 20s. But Sydney, like so many other cities around the world, got caught up in the Great Depression. There was high unemployment, especially in the inner city working class. The building of the Harbour Bridge continues despite the Depression and in fact becomes this real symbol of hope for Sydney. And it was completed in 1932 and is considered an extraordinary engineering feat.
This colossal structure will stand as a monument to British engineering skill and courage.
In all, 1,400 laborers worked on the project, 16 of whom lost their lives during its construction.
Completely changed the scale of the city, both physically and in terms of skyline.
The bridge was massive and was the widest bridge ever at the time. This enormous structure that was built well in advance of demand.
It's one of the great bridges built in any city in the world. Remarkable public work.
The intricate and massive web of steel conveys some impression of the immensity of this all-British engineering feat. Sydney Bridge, like Sydney Harbour, is one of the marvels of the universe.
The opening in 1932 must have been a fantastic time for everyone, at least in Sydney and probably New South Wales, because it was very much a day of celebration, a moment of joy, and it's such a big achievement for something of that scale to have been built.
During that first hour, 200,000 people crossed the bridge, a record that remains unbroken to this day. Nowadays, people don't walk over the bridge, they drive across at much the same speed and pay for the privilege. That's really money for jam.
49 meters wide and 1,149 meters long, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is the largest steel arch in the world. It's held together by 6 million rivets, which were all driven into place by hand.
It originally had 2 lanes of trams that were meant to be the Northern Beaches railway line. It's got 6 lanes of traffic, then has what's now a cycleway on one side and a pedestrian way on the other.
The $13.5 million price tag exceeded what Treasury could afford, so tolls were introduced, making private users pay 6 pence or 5 cents for a car, 3 pence or 2 cents for a horse. The bridge was finally paid off in 1988, but the toll system persists, raising around 80 million Australian dollars a year. That's used to cover the cost of ongoing maintenance and to help pay for the tunnel that now runs beneath Sydney Harbour, a necessary addition to the city's motorway system, as the population and car ownership continue to steadily rise.
Each year, more and bigger cars swell the ranks of the procession that daily snakes its way to and from the city at peak hours. Expressways certainly help after the bridge has been negotiated, but perish the thought, it appears the only real solution to Sydney's problem is another bridge.
What did the governments in the post-war era invest in? It was the Holden. It wasn't railways or the like. And the more roads you build, the more cars you will have. No city in the world has ever solved the car problem by building more motorways. All they've done is generate more congestion.
There's a quote, I think this is Lewis Mumford, solving congestion by widening roads is like solving obesity by loosening your belt. You're not solving obesity, you're accommodating increased growth.
Today, around 1/3 of Sydney's urban fabric is dedicated to roads and car parks, with more lanes and motorways woven into the landscape every year, despite the global trend discouraging the use of private vehicles in cities.
Cars are sort of antisocial beasts, and they're not good for our health. People get more aggressive in their cars. They simply just take so much room, as well as noise, pollution, congestion, all those space.
We have a planning department, and lots and lots of people are employed, and they make lots of plans, and they make no difference to anything. Even in Cabinet, planning doesn't take any precedence because there's also a Minister for Roads and a Minister for Transport. And of course, that's where all the money goes. And so where the money goes is where the power is. You do the roads, and it's like, oh, you had a plan? Oh, sorry. That's really nice that you've got a plan, but that can sit on the shelf. We're just going to put this motorway in, okay?
A point in case, the $16.8 billion highly contentious West Connects project, a 33-kilometer motorway linking western and southwestern Sydney to the city, airport and Port Botany precincts. Supporters of the project cite the removal of 52 sets of traffic lights motorists would otherwise encounter on a journey between Parramatta and the city, and an anticipated 40-minute reduction in the commute from Parramatta to Sydney Airport. But its critics claim it's redundant infrastructure, and as such, a complete waste of money.
You know, the biggest motorway project in the history of this country, about, 15 years after we know that we don't want to do any more fossil fuels, and we know that climate change is happening and this is a real thing. But no, we're still building, 10-lane and sort of 12-lane motorways, knocking down heritage suburbs. I think that's disastrous. I think that's really, really ill-advised. And even 20 years ago, places like Berlin and San Francisco were knocking down motorways and putting up housing instead, public housing quite often. And we're still doing the opposite, So I think that's disastrous. There are lots of ways of doing density, and I think we do it badly. Places like Berlin and Paris are better at doing it than we are, and that's partly because they don't just say to developers, whatever you like.
As lawless as this situation sounds, it pales in comparison to what was happening in the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
It was a complete snake pit, full of corrupt and nepotistic government, fantastically wild and self-interested.
Today, even more dramatic changes are taking place as many of the old landmarks and the not-so-old make way for new developments to match the city's economic progress.
There was a lot of damage. It led to the Heritage Act and the whole idea of heritage in the city, but we'd already lost a lot in those two or three decades.
The old gave way to the new with little or no regard to history. Whole precincts of the city and its suburbs were stripped of their identity. And yet somehow, amid this madness, a building that would redefine the entire country was finding its form.
This is the most controversial building in Australia and probably in the world. An adventure in design and construction, it has set a new precedent that's not only restricted to architecture, it must be the biggest budget beater ever built.
The incomparable Sydney Opera House.
I love Sydney Opera House. Just love it. It's one of my favourite places to go to. I can't imagine Sydney without it. You come from Circular Quay, you walk around the bay, and then there's this majestic sculpture there in front of you.
It's so recognisable and it's become so Sydney, although isn't it funny that it was designed and made almost completely by foreigners, given how much we regard it as ours.
And I think Sydney also probably likes that because it shows that we have links to the outside world. We're comfortable sitting in the context of an international setting.
In an economy that was rapidly expanding, thanks to an influx of post-World War II European immigrants, Australia was looking for a way to express its cultural awakening, newfound optimism, and transforming sense of self.
It all began in the 1950s, with designers from around the world competing for one of the prizes of the century. The winning entry was the creation of Danish architect Jørn Utzon.
Utzon was this tall, enlightened, educated, naive Scandinavian bowling into Sydney as if this was a civilised place, which it actually wasn't at all. So he's like this refined dude thinking, I've won this competition, now all we have to do is build it.
He presented these fantastic drawings and had this amazing vision.
But then, of course, it proved to be impossible to build.
Utzon's design was ahead of its time and technology, and much to his chagrin, it needed to be radically altered.
Ove Arup, the very famous engineer, was very involved, and he actually helped Utzon come to the conclusion of how it should be built.
Over the years, there have been alterations to the original concept, but the basic idea of white sails floating on the harbour remains.
His original scheme, the shells were much flatter. Later on, they became segments of a sphere as a means of working out how to build it.
Correcting the sails of the Opera House required a considerable variation. But a far more complex set of problems came to light on site. In the rush to push the project forward, the underlying geology of Bennelong Point had been assumed rather than accurately surveyed. necessitating a complete rethink of how the building's foundation should be constructed in muddy alluvial soil as opposed to sandstone bedrock. This preparatory work was never budgeted for and sent the project down a never-ending slippery slope of time and money overruns.
All sorts of problems in the process, took a lot longer to build. When you don't know how something's going to be built, it's difficult to be able to budget for it.
When work started, the estimated cost of Sydney's new Opera House was £3.5 million. After only 1 year, it was £5 million. By 1964, the £12.5 million had escalated to £17.5. Now, almost 2 years later, they are talking in terms of a final cost of an astronomical £30 million. Some price to pay for culture.
Every step took longer than expected. Every element proved more expensive. Even the finish on the tiles took 3 years to perfect, and countless hours to create and lay. A daunting 1,056,006 tiles arranged in 26 different beds.
Those cynics who said this bird would never fly had to eat their words, as month by month the sails rose higher to reach the sun.
Finally, after several decades, the Opera House completed its metamorphosis, opening in 1973, a colossal 1,438% over budget.
Close up with those great bits of concrete where the shells come down to the ground and those huge curved beams, and you know that they're diving into the ground and being tied underneath. And the concrete is so muscular and so fabulous. It's this kind of giant creature. So yeah, it's impossible not to love it.
Sydney gets more like New York every day. Her latest skyscraper is to be the most modern of its kind in the southern hemisphere. Built to the maximum permissible height, it goes up 150 feet, a massive framework of steel.
While the Opera House was under construction, another record-breaking building was on the rise, Australia's Square Tower.
As Sydney began to grow, buildings began to get taller. Australia Square was designed by a very interesting architect, Harry Seidler, who was, for a long time, was probably Australia's most famous architect.
It's a real pivot from old Sydney to modern Sydney. They lobbied to get the height limit removed, the 150-foot height limit, replaced with what's called a floor space ratio. So if your site was 100 square metres, you could have 1,200 square metres, but in any shape. So it could be 50 stories high, but very thin. And so for the first time, that sort of incredible glittering harbour became a commodity. Sydney's whole centre of gravity shifted from being down near Central Station, where the shopping centre had been and all of the department stores had been, to being downtown, because that's where workers would be and that's where you could sell floor space. And so that's where all the prime money was going to be in the future.
In Sydney in the 1960s, the early towers were government towers. And so Australia Square was the exemplar of the private speculative tower.
It applied a very modernist approach, not only to the design of the office building, but also to the public spaces around it.
30 buildings were demolished to make way for Australia Square, a complex which successfully combined public space and private offices, art and retail, with the cylindrical tower complete with its groundbreaking revolving restaurant, occupying just 25% of the land.
It's the high spot of the changing skyline of Sydney, Australia. 50 stories and 600 feet high, it's been built in record time at the rate of a new story every week.
At the time, Australia Square Tower was the tallest lightweight concrete building in the world and showcased a completely new construction methodology. It utilized a unique structural system developed in collaboration with Pier Luigi Nervi, one of the world's leading engineers at the time, which would give rise to the tapered column skyscrapers that are so popular today.
I think that, in a sense, the 60s was an aberration in terms of claiming the city as a business district, because it's actually the city centre for everybody. In 1900, the city was full of people living in it. And in the post-war period, the city was voided of its residential population. Now there's a much healthier mix of residential with office and all other things in the city centre.
So you're living basically in mansions in the sky in some places.
Everyone says, well, every Australian would prefer to live in a house. That's clearly not true.
When I left Britain, 65% of people were living in council housing, what we call housing commission. You come to Australia, you can buy the mythical quarter-acre block. You can have your own house, and it was the dream for a lot of people. But the city had to spread further and further out to accommodate all these quarter-acre blocks.
And of course, the further you move out from the city centre, the longer the workday commute, leading many to forgo the backyard for a more central and communal way of living.
Close to services, close to transport, close to jobs, close to entertainment options and shopping and the like. They prefer the view to the garden and, perhaps the sociability of the apartment as opposed to the sociability of the suburban street.
Apartments are often seen as breaking up communities, overshadowing old houses and things. But in some ways, they're actually keeping communities together. Some people go into apartments to be part of a community, and some people go into apartments for anonymity. And the remarkable thing about it is you can have both. If you choose not to talk to your neighbours in the lift, they will get the message very quickly. But, if you're chatty and other people are, well, the conversation starts on the 12th floor and keeps going out into the street. You really get that sense of the vertical village that they talk about.
While the old city buildings are virtually disappearing overnight to be replaced by new ones, the population is exploding too, heading for a figure of 5 million by the turn of the century.
While many inner-city blocks have been razed to make way for residential towers, others have become gentrified, affordable only to the wealthy elite.
During the 60s and 70s, people were buying into those areas because they were cheap. I remember my father telling me when he was growing up that Paddington was essentially a slum.
Kind of on the fringes of the city. It's lots of windy, twisty little laneways that were deemed to be very inconvenient 35 years ago, but are now seen to be charming, and they slow the traffic down, which was a bad thing 30 years ago, but it's a good thing now.
Call it what you will, revitalization, rejuvenation, urban renewal. At the end of the day, it sends the cost of housing in the inner city soaring.
The ring within about 10 kilometres of the city centre, depending on your transport mode, that's the area under the greatest pressure for gentrification.
People who we need to work and run our cities, the people who work in shops, the doctors, the nurses, the policemen, can't actually afford to live in those areas. And so suddenly they have to live further away and travel into the city. It's nice that some of these suburbs are retained and redeveloped, but a lot of the character is lost. Marrickville, Newtown, Waterloo, Redfern. As these areas become gentrified, we don't get the diversity or chaos that was in those suburbs that made them so vibrant.
Sydney's King's Cross, home to the city's entertainment quarter and one of its most popular tourist destinations. But crime and hard drugs abound here, proving a continuing source of concern for city authorities and community organizations.
One part of the city that buckled to both gentrification and vertical development was King's Cross, Sydney's infamous red light district, the go-to place for hookers and hustlers, hapless drunks and hopeless junkies, the tired, the poor, the wretched refuse of Sydney's teeming shores.
All of this wonderful sort of ferment and turmoil was embedded in the Cross, and it was a wonderful place to be. It was just exciting.
The Cross was always seen as a place where the rest of Sydney could go and let their hair down. It's a bit like Brits going to Ibiza and behaving in ways that they would never dream of behaving at home.
I'm very sorry that it became so gentrified. I actually thought that was a mistake. I think that people should have been allowed to live in apartments there, but they shouldn't have been allowed to object to the life that was already there and the culture that was already there, which was really important to Sydney. The cross was built essentially by European bohemia in the sort of 20s. It's where sex and drugs and rock and roll arrived in Australia in the Vietnam War.
American troops were coming into Woolloomooloo and just coming straight up the hill to King's Cross, where there were an abundance of young ladies, professional and otherwise, who were happy to accommodate their needs. And they brought with them heroin. That was the big game changer there.
A more recent game changer came in the form of lockout laws, introduced in response to the deaths of 2 young Sydneysiders coward-punched on the street in separate incidents.
People were just reading and hearing all the time that all these terrible things had happened in the cross, and nobody wanted to go there because they felt, well, they could be the next person. And then they changed the laws so that bars had to close earlier and you couldn't go from one bar to another after a certain time. Ironically, both of these deaths occurred early in the evening, but it was used as a reason to shut down a lot of the bars early.
I didn't think the lockout laws should be imposed anyway because it destroyed Sydney's nightlife, but I especially think that shouldn't have been imposed in the way that they were in the cross, because in combination with the gentrification, they've really wrecked the culture without providing anything very interesting in its place.
While the lockout laws in other parts of the city have since been lifted, those that stymied the nightlife in King's Cross remain in place.
The number of incidents of serious injury caused by drunken behavior has just plummeted. But what's happened is that they've moved elsewhere. The areas that were not affected boomed.
Rumor has it the reforms proved a lucky strike for 24-hour licensed venues, such as the Star Casino, which welcomed revelers in from the neighboring Darling Harbour Entertainment Precinct and Barangaroo, Sydney's newest and most contentious harbour-side development.
And here we have successive state governments, 7 premiers, giving away 22 hectares of public land, not to the highest bidder, actually to a cartel with a secret deal which still isn't public. I think Darling Harbour and Barangaroo are intense failures for Sydney, and we need to look at them and say never again. The street system is dysfunctional, and you've had, the biggest, fattest, ugliest buildings built right on the harbour. It's thrown away deep sea wharfage, which is something which we'll never build again in Sydney.
The original, more socially inclusive plan for Barangaroo was overturned as developers sought to maximize their return on investment, essentially turning the precinct into an enclave of privilege and high prices, with yet another casino and hotel complex soaring from its heart.
There's still time, but not much. Otherwise, foreshores like this will be lost forever.
Change is inevitable, and it can be good and it can be bad. And I think we all need to be vigilant to try and make sure that change is good, but of course it isn't always good. And I think also we need to measure the speed of change. When change happens quickly, it's less likely to be good.
In 30 years' time, we'll be back demolishing Darling Harbour again because it's trash urbanism. And we cannot afford trash urbanism in the 21st century. If you're going to talk about sustainability at all, you need to make long-term decisions and get them right, and you need to build for the long term, not this sort of disposable city.
The issue of sustainability is high on every council agenda in the metropolitan area of Greater Sydney, with climate change emerging as the front-running stressor as it threatens to increase the severity and frequency of heat waves, floods and fires.
Because of the geographical location and the make of the Sydney Basin, for the whole peri-urban fringe, bushfire is a huge risk.
The fire can shoot up many, many gullies even around the harbour in extreme circumstances. And so we absolutely are at grave risk of bushfire because of our topography and our urban form, our dispersed form. What's particularly striking is that the air quality was so damaged while the fires were actually hundreds of kilometres away.
Everything was smoke covered. You couldn't really tell if it's closer or further away.
With smoke from the fires making the air increasingly toxic, hospital admissions across the city spiked, rendering a bad situation far worse. Given the heat wave that was already in play, smashing previous records in the outer western suburbs, with the blistering 48.9 degree reading.
It becomes really, really dangerous for people to live under these conditions.
And as counterintuitive as it sounds, when wildfires bear down on the city, it's imperative to plant more trees.
The most important role for green space is the mitigation of heat, keeping temperatures down. This is one of the biggest problems that we see, where urbanization itself causes heat because you're taking away vegetation and you're replacing it with hard infrastructure that heats cities up, contributing hugely to heat budgets within cities. And that is something we can mitigate, or try at least to lower the impacts through green infrastructure. It doesn't have to be trees, it can be any other type of open space. Blue space that could be a lake, a creek, anything related to water. The larger the better. It cools down, particularly during those peak heat events, heat waves.
Just after Christmas in Sydney, temperature 103 in the shade. Does that make you want to emigrate? While we hurry along frozen streets, this is how they're spending their leisure time in Sydney.
The other things, of course, related to heat are transport. Once you get to a certain temperature, trains have to slow down. That means your commute is extended. Everything moves slower. You have higher stress on infrastructure, so roads become really hot. We have instances where bitumen can start to melt. Therefore, there's more stress on our road infrastructure. And that, of course, means that over time you have to put more repair work in, costing you more.
These are complex issues which will require robust discussion and cooperation to address.
We need to build more prudently. We shouldn't be building on the fringes exposed to fire. We shouldn't be building in floodplains affected by rising waters. We need to build more intelligently, more compactly. There's a very good argument for saying Sydney should not subdivide another block on its perimeter.
So there's been a development of a vision for Sydney by an organisation called the Greater Sydney Commission. And the idea is it's all about consolidating development and population within 3 particular zones, described as the 3 cities.
So the city centre, as we know it, the historic city at Circular Quay. Parramatta is the second city, and that aspiration has been there since 1789. And then the third city, which is characterised as a parkland city, which is in the west of Sydney around the airport.
Each of them is supposed to be a 30-minute city, and the idea of a 30-minute city is that people can reach the center of each of those eastern, central, and western cities within a 30-minute travel time by public transport or walking or biking.
I think it's a great vision.
But in order for that to actually work in a real way for people, you need to have enough jobs in each of those cities that people who live in those cities can find employment in those cities.
People don't see cities as a transient place anymore, but as a place where they want to live and stay and bring up their family and have a history in it.
I think over the long run, more needs to be done to encourage this job-housing balance, but this is not a change that can occur overnight. This is something that's going to take, decades of rebalancing in order to accommodate.
We have to think about transport, food, energy. These issues need to be addressed in concert, because if you build a city like the metropolis of 3 cities, you need to have concepts to address these overarching issues for a working metropolis, not a struggling metropolis. Nobody wants to live in a struggling metropolis. I don't want to have a livable place. I want to have a lovable place. I want to live in a place that is lovable, where I want to put my roots down.
This desire for a lovable city suits Sydney to a T. Despite its many challenges and flaws, there are few places its stalwart supporters would rather be.
I'm a Sydney girl born and bred, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
All we have to do is understand ourselves better, and that will make us happier and make our city better. So it's kind of a pleading in a way.
If you want to really look at the optimism that Sydney should have, look at Circular Quay. It's is anchored by the best infrastructure work of the 20th century and the best public work of the 20th century. And there's no excuse for not having that expectation of quality.
Wind power, solar, regenerative energy, rooftop gardens and farms that can produce food locally. We can build roads from solar panels. We can use technology that is already available to decentralize power distribution. We can do a lot of things. We just have to start doing them and do them in a concerted way. If we really want to get this metropolis right, then this is, I think, what really needs to be addressed.